Good morning. Can I welcome everybody to the 11th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2014? And can I remind everybody present that electronic devices should be switched off because they do interfere with the broadcasting system, particularly mobile phones. Our first item on the agenda this morning is a welcome to Gordon MacDonald to the committee. Welcome, Gordon, is our new member who's here in place of Joan McAlpine. Can I also welcome Kezia Dugdale, who's here as a substitute for Neil Bibby. Can I first of all invite Gordon MacDonald to declare any relevant registrable interests?
Thank you, Convener. I have no registrable interests. However, on a voluntary basis, I'd like to highlight that I'm a member of both Historic Scotland and the National Trust. And in addition, I'm an unpaid trustee for Dad's Rock, Scotland's only free music playgroup for dads and their children.
Okay, thank you much, Gordon. Can I also ask, given this is Kezia's first meeting here on the Education Committee, can I also invite Kezia to declare any registrable relevant interests?
There's no registrable interest.
Okay, thank you. And can I also welcome Liz back, who's here substituting for Mary Scanlon. So you haven't been away very long, Liz, but welcome back. Our second item today is to take evidence on an affirmative instrument, namely the Young People's Involvement in Education and Training Provision of Information Scotland Order 2014. Can I welcome to the committee Angela Constance, Minister for Youth Employment, and her supporting officials from the Scottish Government. Good morning, Minister. Can I remind everybody that officials are not allowed to contribute to our next item, where the Minister will formally move the motion for the order to be approved. However, this item, therefore, is the opportunity for members to question the Minister and officials on the instrument. Can I therefore begin by inviting the Minister to make any opening remarks that you wish to?
Okay, thank you, Convener, and good morning, colleagues. This, I believe, is a positive piece of legislation which supports the key objectives of our post-16 education reforms, namely to improve the life chances of our young people, to support Scotland's economic ambitions and to create a more sustainable and secure system. Essentially, to improve the life chances of our young people, it's absolutely fundamental that we can identify those young people who need our support. We need to ensure that those partners who are most familiar with our young people's education and training needs, that they work together to help young people make successful transition from school through to sustainable employment, and that those partners also offer targeted extra support to young people where and when it is needed. So we need to put the systems in place where the right professionals get the right information at the right time to give our young people the help that they need when they need it. And this approach must be consistent across all parts of the country. As members will be aware, the Post-16 Education Scotland Act 2013 was passed by the Parliament last year, and that provided the enabling powers to achieve this. So this is secondary legislation, and it now gives us a more detailed framework to put in place some necessary steps and systems. So Skills Development Scotland will have the information it needs to proactively identify and engage young people who have disengaged from education or training, and by utilising the information effectively and appropriately, it can assure that qualified professionals can provide the support and provision a young person might need to move back into learning, training or work. Now, Convener, I know there are many local examples where information about young persons in education or training is currently being shared, but a lack of a consistent national approach has impacted on our ability to assist those young people who are most in need. So this order means that Skills Development Scotland will be able to identify those young people on a more consistent basis and provide assistance and support that will encourage successful involvement in education training wherever they are in Scotland. Convener, I do not believe that it's enough to wait for a young person who drops out to contact SDS for help. The risks to that young person's future are far too great, and there are very clear detrimental effects from long-term disengagement from work, education or training to a young person's future economic potential, and early intervention to support re-engagement quickly is absolutely vital. And in sharing information about young people, we will be able to more quickly move to identify when a young person drops out and to proactively make contact with them. And also to understand more about the reasons why that young person has dropped out. And of course, there are opportunities for all commitment to offer an appropriate way forward. So I'll leave my remarks there, Convener, and obviously I'm delighted to answer any questions that the committee has.
Thank you very much, Minister. Can I begin by asking about the provision of information? I mean, effectively, if I go back to the evidence that we took on this particular part of the then bill, I think it's fair to say we were somewhat, it was less than clear. I think it's probably a reasonable description of it. So I want to seek some clarity about some of the individual points that we tried to get information on at the time. Now, it seems to be that some of the information that's provided to SDS is also information that is already held by SDS, or it's information that SDS will provide to others. And I just want to try and get some clarity around this process. For example, one of the things that SDS will provide information to others and will be provided information to it is the young person's anticipated school leaving date, as one example. There are others. How exactly does this work? I know it's a mutual sharing of information, but again, I'm not entirely clear about how it operates in reality.
I suppose different articles of the order set out different responsibilities on different agencies. So, firstly, as a result of this order, there's an obligation on education authorities, colleges, SAS, Scottish Funding Council, all to supply information to Skills Development Scotland, at least on a monthly basis, a calendar monthly basis. And what the order does is it sets out the type of information as opposed to the exact nature of that information. And that's to ensure that there's local flexibility and that we don't have to continuously come back to amend the order. Skills Development Scotland's responsibilities are to create a secure web portal which is to be continuously updated so that the various partners can get access to the information that they require about young people that they are involved with or who they have been involved in.
Thank you for that. I'm still not absolutely clear on this. I mean, effectively, the same information is being both requested by SDS and provided by SDS.
I suppose that there may well be, overlaps in information, but you would expect that the local authority to be best placed to supply information, for example, about a school leaving date. I don't know, Gavin, do you want to add anything about some of the specifics that the convener is looking for?
Yeah, no, so I mean, I think basically, what the order does is give that framework for exactly what the information. So rather than SDS being obliged to give the information back, it allows the local authorities to access that information. So something like the school date, the school leaving date, clearly the school would enter that, the local authority would provide that data, which would then be held on the hub, and then that would be part of the information that the authority would be able to access about that individual. So it's just to be clear about what the parameters are.
No, sorry, I'm more confused now.
Sorry.
Why would the local authority have to access the hub to find out the leaving date of somebody for school? Because sorry, let me just finish. Sorry. Because surely the local authority is the organisation supplying the information. If the local authority doesn't know the leaving date of children in its own care, that seems to me odd, to say the least.
They wouldn't have to access the information from it. It just means that they would be able to see the information that SDS was holding on the hub, so they would be able to check that information. They would clearly be the ones that would own that information about the understanding of what the school leaving date was, I think.
I suppose, Convener, there's a range of information that we would expect Skills Development Scotland and partners to be sharing with each other. And at the end of the day, the raison d'etre of this order is to capture information when it changes. So, of course, local authorities are best placed to advise of information such as a school leaving date. But what we are looking for that routine engagement is for information to be shared, particularly when information about a young person changes, when their circumstances changes or their needs change, or when they're at risk of disengaging either from education or training.
Well, don't get me wrong, Minister. I mean, I'm very supportive of that. I think that's what should happen, and I think should happen on a national basis. And I was very supportive of it went through the bill. It was just the clarity of how the process actually operates. You mentioned, and I'm sure others will pick up on some of the points I've raised, but I just want to ask a specific question because you mentioned it. You said that the instrument provides for the information to be provided no less frequently than monthly. At stage 1, officials said to this committee that they expected information to be provided to SDS on a fortnightly basis. Why has that changed?
I'll ask Scott, can you answer that?
Yeah, of course. Because of the nature of the business for the number of partners, for some fortnightly may be best. For an education authority to exchange information or to share information with SDS on a fortnightly basis might work best for them. On others, it's on a monthly basis. So within the scope of legislation, for our purposes to identify a young person who's dropping out, at least once a calendar month we deem to be the most efficient way of doing that, although the partners themselves still have to have data sharing agreements in place. So they may deem to help their business processes, they will do it more than once.
Yeah, I can perfectly understand the rationale for the answer you've just given, but the answer that was given to us at stage 1 was it's expected that information will be provided to SDS on a fortnightly basis. What I'm trying to ascertain is what has changed between the discussion and the evidence we were given at stage 1 and the position that you're now outlining, which is it should be on a monthly basis, although some organisations obviously could or may prefer to do it on a fortnightly basis.
Pragmatism, really. I think what we want to do was we want to be able to capture young people, but we don't want to create an industry in itself. So with some of the partners sharing once a month fits in with our business processes, and it meets the scope of what we're trying to do in the order and in the policy. And for others, it's a fortnight. So,
okay. Thank you for that, Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Could I open by saying that I entirely agree with the aims and objectives of what you're trying to do, because I think it's essential, just as you said, Minister, we are in desperate need of trying to improve the quality of the information. Like the Convener, I was left thoroughly confused at stage 1 when the evidence was given to us by SDS, both on the basis of how they felt that quality would actually be delivered, and secondly about the timescales. And with respect this morning, I think what we're looking for is further clarity on who it is who's actually coordinating this information, because I'm not clear in my mind as to the overall person or body that has the oversight of where that information is, the quality of it, how we measure the quality of it, which I think is essential, and I think my colleague Liam MacArthur will pick up on this later. It's about the quality of that information that is essential. But secondly, about the timescales, personally I think it is confusing to have one set of witnesses that are telling us it will be on a 2-week basis, whereas the government seems to think it will be on monthly, maybe slightly beyond that, particularly if, as you've just mentioned, Minister, there are discrepancies across different areas of Scotland. Could I just tease out the exact detail on this? Who is responsible for the overall oversight of where this information is, and who has decided upon the responsibilities of the different groups? Could you tell me that in the first instance? Yes,
well, I think it's very clear, Convener, that Skills Development Scotland have overall responsibility. They have a lead responsibility in this area, and the point that Liz Smith makes about quality of information is very well made and is a main driver for this order. Now, obviously, individual partners have obligations in terms of data and in terms of their own practices about the quality of information. But what this order does, and in terms of Skills Development Scotland's role, is that there is, I suppose, an additional checks on the quality of that information, and I'm sure officials could answer any more technical issues about that. In terms of timescales, I mean, what the order is saying is that information should be shared as a minimum on a calendar month basis. And I appreciate, what committee is saying, that it's not always helpful to be told one thing at one meeting and then another. But I suppose we have to set the bar somewhere. And as Scott Gray has intimated, we need to be clear about where the minimum practice, where we need the framework of that national system. And of course, there will be some local variation, but that has to be in the context of a national system where we have reliable quality information so that we know more about that story and that journey of young people and their transition from school through education training into employment.
Thank you for that answer. I mean, obviously you clarified that SDS has the overall responsibility. I think that gives me some satisfaction that the government sees that as the way forward. Where my concern lies, and when they came to this committee, they were very unclear in their answers about that responsibility and how the delivery of that key information was going to be made. And secondly, about the timescale, it rather alarms me that we have one set of witnesses saying that it will be on a 2-week basis, and yet that's clearly not going to be the case. So perhaps could I suggest that we have a little bit more discussion about that, because I think it's such a crucial area, particularly for the youngsters themselves, that they feel that they are well informed and the people who are looking after them are well informed. But we've got a clear difference of opinion in too many areas about this part of what was the post-16 bill, where I don't think that there is confidence that that information is accurate and that it will be used in the most effective way. Could I just ask for your comments on that bit?
I think the order is a significant step forward in ensuring a baseline, and as I've already said to committee, we'll have that sharing of information on a minimum of a calendar month. Ultimately, and let me be clear with committee, Skills Development Scotland are responsible, particularly at that operational level, for leading this piece of work. Skills Development Scotland will be or are responsible to myself, and in terms of how things are delivered in practice, of course, myself and indeed Skills Development Scotland will be more than happy to keep committee informed and involved every step of the way. But this order today is a significant step forward in being clear about who has responsibility for what, and they need to, as we all agree, to take things forward and actually to have a consistent basis of that sharing of information. But the order is clear. It's a minimum of a monthly calendar month.
Minister, I entirely accept that. Could I just finish on the point that I think the order is relatively clear. I wouldn't entirely agree it's 100% clear. But I think what I'm asking is that there is a practical issue here to ensure that the best quality information is delivered in the right places. And we were left as a committee in considerable doubt that that was actually going to be the case. And if I could ask if you could ask SDS to provide this committee with a frequent update on exactly how this is working, because if we don't have that, I think we're going to be left a little bit in the dark.
Convener, I would be more than happy to ensure that that happens. And if I can say to Ms Smith, I can't change the past in terms of what information has come forward to this committee at an earlier stage, but we can certainly move forward together in the recognition that this is a very important order. It's quite, discreet and quite specific about who's responsible for what. But I would be more than willing and more than happy to ensure that committee is fully involved in understanding and having that oversight of the practical implication of this order.
Okay, thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Good to see you back in more familiar territory. As Liz Smith indicated, I think the policy objectives here are ones the committee are fully signed up to, although you'll be aware, no doubt, of some concerns that emerged at the time about the creation of a kind of mega database. Now, I think we were given assurances that, in a sense, this is about collecting data that's already obtained and hosted by the various different organisations and making sure that's shared more appropriately. But has there been any consideration given to what happens to the data once a young person is no longer caught within the ambit, whether that's 16 to 24 or 16 to 25? What happens to the data over the kind of medium to longer term?
I mean, obviously, Skills Development Scotland and its partners have obligations in terms of data protection, and there are limits to how long you can retain data. And normally, data under these circumstances that are set in the order will be retained until a young person's 25. But much of the raison d'etre of this order is to get, a far better handle on what young people are participating in when, and it's essentially to identify young people who have either dropped out of education or training, or who are at risk of disengaging, so that we can proactively act on that information. So while we have the mechanisms for gathering information, it is nonetheless important at an operational level the SDS and their partners are actually operating and responding to the information they receive. I also think it's important that over time we will get more qualitative information about young people and their journeys, and that should inform some of our policy initiatives. We're all aware of statistics, and I suppose some of the limitations in and around statistics, and I think this order in terms of the sharing of data will help us unlock information actually about a young person's journey and identify, I hope, more clearly some of the risk factors associated with young people dropping out of education or training, but also identifying the factors that are more likely to lead to successful engagement as well, and I think that's very important. The other point, Convener, is that this order is, again, part of a journey towards our participation measure. We know, we have record levels of positive destinations if we look at school leaver destinations, but of course school leaver destinations are, twice a year at a particular point in time. We want to have a more meaningful measurement about young people and their participation in education and training. It all starts with some of the basic housekeeping in and around the sharing of data. Is there anything, Gavin, you want to add to that?
As I say, I don't dispute the rationale for the pulling together this information over that period, and indeed over that period that the requirement to intervene in relation to specific individuals may ebb and flow. I mean, that's I think, self-evident. I think the concern, though, is that those not in education or employment or training aren't limited to those in the 16 to 24 age group, and therefore I suppose the concern is to know what will happen to the data of those young people once they reach the age of 24. Is SDS under an obligation to dispose of that information, that data, in a safe and secure fashion? Will it simply hold on to it on the off chance that these individuals may, over the subsequent years, fall in and out of employment or training, and therefore need to be tracked by SDS? Because if that's the case, I think we're into different territory, and that wasn't certainly something the committee was made aware of when we were considering the original proposals.
I think in terms of the purpose of this order, SDS will be under an obligation to get rid of data by the time, in most cases, by the time a young person is 25. I suppose there could be some circumstances where data has to be removed prior to that. This order, I suppose, underpins the opportunities for all commitment, and for some young people that opportunities for all commitment extends up to the age of 24. Now, once we I suppose have more of a picture and more of an insight into the journey of young people, engaging and disengaging from education and training, that may inform what we wish to do in the future. But in terms of the here and now, this is in relation to young people between, data for young people between 15 and 24.
Can I ask a very brief supplementary on that? Just because it just occurred to me when Mr MacArthur was asking his question. Perfectly rational and sensible that the data, of course, under the Data Protection Act is properly dealt with by SDS. But if a young person reaches the age of 24 or 25 and they're not in a positive destination, they're still having problems and difficulties, they still require support, is it the case that SDS will then just, I don't want to just dump that data, but just effectively, I mean, if somebody's not in a positive destination at that point, that data surely still has some value, does it not?
Well, I mean, I think we should maybe ask Ailsa to give input into the, I suppose, the legal aspects of this. I mean, my understanding and appreciation is that it's you can't pick and choose when you comply with data protection, and the order is setting out a framework in terms of how we use information for young people between the ages of 15 and 24. I understand the point the convener is making, particularly when we have an all-age careers service. But in terms of the data protection aspects, I'll ask Ailsa Hain to feedback.
Yeah, I mean, it would obviously be a matter for SDS to work out what it was required to do in terms of data protection legislation. But my understanding would be that if they were still engaging with a person at that age and were providing services to that person, then they could maintain those records. But this order would then not apply to that information, because this order only applies to the sharing of information between SDS and its various partners. So they wouldn't be under the requirements to share information, that information that they hold with other people. But if they were themselves using the information to provide services to that person, I don't see any reason that they couldn't maintain the record. But they wouldn't, in terms of this legislation, be under any obligations to share that information. So
that's helpful. So the obligation is not on the retention of data, it's the sharing of the data at this point.
This is purely about the sharing of the information.
Right. Okay, then that begs. I'm sorry, I know there are other members wishing to get in here, but this is rather crucial, I think. What then? What is the practical process for that to happen? What steps would need to be taken effectively to ring-fence the data within the hub, to separate those whose data is allowed to be shared or accessed by others, and that data which is not?
Well, in terms of SDS sharing the data, I mean, there are certain parties, the colleges, education authorities, are required to provide information into the data hub. SDS, when it shares information that it then holds in its data hub, it's only sharing with colleges or education authorities. So it has much more limited sharing. And I mean, my understanding, I mean, I don't know exactly how the database works. Scott may be able to say more, but they should. They would just, those records would not form part of the records that could be passed on to these to the education authorities or to the colleges, because the person would no longer fall within the parameters of this order.
It would be, and Ailsa's exactly right. The partners would share records with SDS that they had. So just through the fullness of time, people would leave that organisation, so they would no longer have a record to share. Those partners who receive information from SDS receive it in the form of a report. So to fulfil or to complete that report, SDS would extract information from their own management information system and provide it to them. So you would exclude anyone who's gone beyond those age ranges and only include those who had previously featured on in an information sharing with that partner. So it would only be, so an education authority could only receive or gain access to information that they had previously provided information on.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for that. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. Minister, the convener touched earlier on about the risks of overlapping, and I have a concern myself about the potential for unnecessary bureaucracy. Colleges, the Scottish Funding Council and Scottish ministers each provide what seems to be fairly similar information on young people's participation or withdrawal from college courses, and similarly the Scottish Funding Council and Scottish ministers both provide what appears to be similar information on young people's participation or withdrawal from higher education institution courses. Is this actually a duplication? Is it unnecessary bureaucracy?
No, actually, because I think the purpose of this order, as touched on already, is actually the sharing of that information. Of course, these different organisations will have the need to have similar information about young people. But I mean, the order, in essence, is about to ensure consistency of sharing of that information.
Perhaps touching on the consistency of sharing of the information. Colleges, education authorities, Scottish Funding Council and Scottish ministers provide information to SDS, but only colleges and education authorities receive information from SDS. Does that seem correct?
Well, I mean, we've spent a considerable amount of time, consulting with all the agencies and partners who this order places obligations on. That consultation responses have been published. So, we've not developed this order, or indeed the policy surrounding this order in a vacuum. I mean, consultation in a broad sense, goes back to various policy developments, whether it's 16+ learning choices, more chances, opportunities for all. And, a constant theme through that work is the need for consistent sharing of information. And in terms of the specifics in and around this order, the government has consulted on its work on a participation measure for young people that are engaged in education and training. So we are in a constant dialogue with our partners, and we think we're confident that what's proposed to committee is something that's pragmatic and workable. Of course, there are always opportunities to amend the order at a future date, going through the usual processes.
I suppose the concern is, looking at it just on paper, it looks as if it's more or less duplication of information that's coming out there. Are you satisfied, as you partly touched on there, that it's been rationalised as far as possible and that we're not creating a simple bureaucracy and collecting data all over the place?
I think there's an important point about quality assurance. So I appreciate and understand what you're saying about duplication of information, but we need to be confident that the information is accurate and robust, and by the means laid out in the order, and Skills Development Scotland's role in all of this, it is additional means and measures to ensure the quality of that data and that it's robust and that it's correct.
George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Can I just get confirmation of what we mean by saying the term young person? Because in a couple of parts of the instrument doesn't define it, and in a couple of the policy memorandum of the bill suggested that it was 16 to 24-year-olds. Yet there's the policy note in the instrument says 16 to 25. I know it sounds pedantic and silly, but are we 16 to 24 or 16 to 25?
16 to 24.
Okay, thanks.
That's from the Post-16 Education Scotland Act, where the term is defined. So that's how it's clearly defined in Section 20 of the Act. Okay. So that's clearly fixed.
I'm happy.
I'm not. Can I just? Sorry, I know this is, and it is going to sound pedantic, but we had trouble with this and during the stage 1 evidence, and that's why we're taking some time over it. Mr. Adams quite correct. It said 16 to 24. But the policy note for your instrument says 16 to 25. And you've just said it's very clear in the instrument it's 16 to 24 because we're referring back to the Act. So why does the policy note say 16 to 25?
Again, and I'll ask officials to chip in, but my understanding is that it's up to the 25th birthday of a young person.
Yes, Liz Smith.
Could we just have absolute clarity on this, because it may sound pedantic, but I think it's extremely important, because obviously there is a cohort of youngsters in there which is sizable, and we need to know what the fact is on this. One document says 16 to 24 and another policy note says 16 to 25. Can I ask which it is? 16
to 24 up to the 25th birthday. Is that the right terminology, Gavin?
Well,
no.
The instrument's note, the note that is supplied, policy note to this SSI, at paragraph 9 says, the information provided will enable Skills Development Scotland to know which 16 to 25-year-olds, etc., etc. The next sentence again talks about those 16 to 25-year-olds. That's why we're confused, because it did say 16 to 24-year-olds. What we're saying, it is 16 to 24, but it's 24 and 364 days. But that's, just for clarity, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Yes. 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 Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Kezia.
Thank you. Minister, can I be the first to congratulate you on your promotion?
This afternoon. That's why I haven't nobody said it.
Well, anyway, congratulations. When I covered or shadowed you on the youth employment brief, we had a lot of debate around the number of young people who didn't appear in the statistics, people who would leave school but then not appear when the unemployment stats came out. How confident are you that those young people, that particular cohort, will now be caught with this new framework in place?
I suppose I'm more confident. Absolute confidence would be foolish, given that what this order doesn't cover is information from Her Majesty's Revenues and Customs. Now, we have made attempts via 2 UK government bills, but one UK government bill was talked out and another one was withdrawn, and we'll continue to seek opportunities to be able to have an arrangement with Her Majesty's Revenues and Customs. What this order doesn't do either is it can't compel DWP to provide us with information, because that's out with the function and remit of Parliament and the Scottish Government. Although Skills Development Scotland has developed a partnership agreement with DWP, who will share information about young people seeking job seekers allowance. So it puts us on a far stronger footing to have far more accurate and consistent information about young people over a period of time.
You got a ballpark figure in your head about how you'd like to reduce the number of people that we can't find? I mean, this might be wrong, but my recollection was there's something like 17,000 young people we couldn't identify between leaving school and joining the unemployment stats. Have you got a plan to reduce that by a certain amount?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly want to reduce that figure, and it's important to stress that that's young people whose destination is unknown. So they may be young people who've disengaged, but they may be young people who are in a destination and have not been able to ascertain their up-to-date destination. So I suppose, we're looking to reduce that 17,000 figure. There's no specific targets, but obviously given my interest and responsibility in this area and committee's interest and involvement, I'm sure that once this order is implemented that we will most certainly revisit it. And of course the order itself will make the situation more transparent with publicly available information.
We get a lot more data from this system. How do you plan to report that data, and how often will it come to Parliament, or how do you see that working? Or is it simply the case that it will be in SDS's annual report? I would hope it would be more regular than that.
I would certainly hope that we would be able to be responding proactively to the information that this order can help us galvanise, because it is very important information in terms of informing the way forward. really want to get below headline figures and to understand far more about that young person's journey and what works for young people and what doesn't work for young people, and to be able to tailor our policies and a whole range of policies around that information.
Necessarily report at the same time as the APS stats, for example, to give unemployment stats some context. That seems to me a very sensible thing to do, would be to produce a report based on this information, say, every 3 months.
We can certainly look at that, and I certainly would agree that regular reporting of this information is crucial, because it informs everybody's thinking and everybody's development of policy.
Another question I would have for you would be, how does this change the way that SDS will operate regarding the information it itself holds? So, for example, one thing I always found very difficult to identify was how many people had done more than one Get Ready for Work programme, for example. I've certainly met a lot of young people who have been recycled around a number of different employability programmes, but SDS couldn't quantify that for you. Will this new framework allow SDS to hold its data in a more accountable and transparent way that we can access as MSPs?
I would certainly hope that this order enables SDS and all its partners to have far more meaningful information so that we can monitor and track the journey of individual young people, and obviously we'll be in a position to collate that information overall. It gives a big broad national picture, but I mean ultimately we're gathering information to make a difference in the lives of individual young people, and we need to have a stronger evidence base about the success of interventions and how each and every intervention helps in that journey of a young person towards and into work.
And just on that intervention, just finally, Convener, just so I'm absolutely clear in my head in terms of responsibilities, so it would be the responsibility of an education authority or a college or any aspect of further education to flag that a young person had, say, fallen out of education or fallen off an employability programme, but it would be the responsibility of SDS to do the intervening. Is that correct?
I think in many instances, yes, but dependent on the information supplied about a young person, dependent on the information that has changed. If, for example, it's a housing problem that's resulted in a young person disengaging from education or training, SDS may not be the best person. If it's a young person with quite a substantial social work background, there may be somebody better. But in terms of oversight and leading, it's clearly a responsibility of SDS, and SDS will have, as they do just now, responsibilities to follow up young people, and they've increased their interventions in that area in terms of how often they will attempt to make contact with a young person, but they will have a responsibility to be discussing with partners, quite often perhaps guidance staff in schools, as to who best to follow up a young person. But some of that is dependent on the circumstances that a young person finds himself in.
Surely, though, one person's got to be ultimately responsible, and that's got to be SDS. I'm just thinking about, the logic of the named person, for example. The strength of that system is that ultimately there's one individual who's responsible for all the information and everything to do with that person's journey. Surely it would apply here that SDS are ultimately responsible for everything to do with 16 to 24-year-olds.
Yes, they are responsible, and as I've already intimated, they have lead responsibility, but they may have a very sensible, pragmatic discussion with other partners, particularly for young people who have very complex, difficult backgrounds, that someone else may be better placed to do that follow-up. And I'm thinking that there may be someone who that young person already knows and has a relationship with, as opposed to yet another person stepping into the life of a young person. But
they're ultimately responsible.
Yes.
Okay. Can I just follow up on that? Just one final sort of question, just for sorry for clarity, Minister. You gave an example of housing being the underlying problem that may result in somebody falling out of training or education, or in just underlying social work connected issue. Perfectly understandable. Obviously, within this instrument, SDS does not share information with either the social work department or the housing department. If it's the case that the information comes from one of these departments to SDS to say this young person is in danger of or has fallen out of education and training because of an underlying housing problem, what do SDS do? Because they don't deal with the housing problem and they don't share information with the housing department. So what do they do?
No, well, they'll have to contact the relevant agency that does deal but with in this case, the housing problem, if that's the example we're going on. And a lot will depend on the age of the young person as well, and whether they're at school or education. Or
so they would contact, I mean, I'm using this example because it was an example you gave, but they would contact the housing department to try and help. I mean, obviously that's welcome to try and help, but I'm just trying to clarify, what would that contact be? Because they can't share, they're not going to share the information that they have. So what would they do?
Do you want to answer this, Scott?
Yeah, it's the sharing itself is really just it's a signposting measure. So if SDS was alerted to the fact that somebody dropped out, what this sharing does is it improves the chances of SDS finding out that somebody's dropped out. But the information sharing doesn't replace the professional contact. All this really is to try and get the right information to the right professional. Now, all local authorities will have their own processes in place, so if a young person, regardless of the issue of why they've dropped out, the SDS frontline member of staff will be aware of those, but they'll only be aware that the person is no longer attending either the college or the bit of training provision. It's then the professional takes over and contacts the individual or contacts the training provider and says, I understand that Scott's no longer there. What's happened?
Sorry, maybe it's me, but I'm still struggling a little bit. Are you saying that effectively the professional, when you say the professional, do you mean the professional within SDS?
Yes.
Professional within SDS would then contact the housing department and say there's a problem, or would they not?
You would imagine through the scope of this sharing, the SDS would find out, I think the original point was when they would find out if someone had dropped out. So through the scope of this sharing, if SDS were alerted to the fact that someone dropped out of their course of provision, I would imagine, but this is more of a procedural thing for SDS and MEAR, but I would imagine that they would want to understand the circumstances for why the young person's left. So the sharing of information would trigger that conversation to take place.
But the conversation you're talking is between the SDS professional and whom?
And it would either be and again, this is when you're starting to get into how they provide services to individuals, but it would either be with the individual themselves to ask them why they've dropped out, or with the training or learning provider as to why the young person is no longer there.
Okay, so they do not contact the housing department.
That would imagine would be the next step down the line.
They do contact the housing department.
In this circumstance, you would imagine the first conversation would be to understand the circumstances of why they've dropped out.
No, I understand that. I'm trying to understand the process by which, if somebody contacts SDS and says this young person is in danger of or has fallen out because of a housing problem, they then contact the individual, for example, and have a conversation about that. Do they then contact the housing department and say, you know, what's the problem here? Why is this person having difficulty with their housing? Or
I would imagine they would contact the local authority.
You would imagine.
If SDS have established why a young person has dropped out from education or training, you know, they will have to be forwarding that information on to a relevant agency. And if it's the example of housing, you would expect them to be, you know, contacting the local authority. I suppose if the young person was known to social work, they might be contacting their social work. But if I can be clear, you know, it is my expectation that all professionals involved with young people act on the information that they receive. This isn't, you know, we're not gathering information for the sake of gathering information. We're gathering information so that the relevant professionals can act upon that information. And we know that that's in the interest of young people and their economic future, but is also essential to the future of our country as well, that we're intervening early. You know, part of this government's agenda across a range of policy initiatives is to intervene early in the lives of young people, particularly where there are risks. And in the instance of this order, it's for intervening early for young people who are at risk of disengaging from education and training, because we're in the business of preventing long-term unemployment.
There's absolutely no argument about that. I mean, and I am fully behind the intention of the order, absolutely 100%. What this committee's role is, I think, is to try and follow up on the evidence we got at stage 1 and clarify the process is both practical and realistic and actually will work. And I think that's what we're trying to do. I think the issue for me here is I'm trying to clarify in my own mind that the instrument provides for the formal relationship in terms of data sharing between certain bodies. But there's nothing in it which stops SDS informing or having that discussion between professionals, for example, about housing or a social work problem.
Absolutely not. Let me just reiterate, Convener. I can't turn the clock back. I've been listening very carefully to the issues that you've raised about the stage 1 evidence. But in terms of the here and now, I expect professionals involved with young people to be acting upon the information that they receive.
Okay, thank you. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. Morning. Just as I'm listening to those last few exchanges, I can't help, Convener, but want to raise the issue of the named person and the GIRFIC process. And there will be some young people in this system who fall within the age range that's covered by Getting It Right for Every Child. And I note from the schedule that education authorities will be expected to supply information in relation to a young person's support needs. So I'm presuming that will come via GIRFIC, and I don't know if that's a question that can be answered this morning, but I just would like to at least ask it, because there has to be a link between the systems that are already in place for this to happen and the functions that are expected to be carried out under this order.
Yes. Yeah, I mean that's a short answer, Convener. The information does need to be shared and linked. And
given the time, I think short answers and short questions are probably a good idea. I apologise. I know it's mostly my fault, but I mean, very quickly, Liz and Liam.
Minister, can I just clarify the last answer you gave to the Convener? You said it was your expectation, if there was an issue about the Housing Department. Do you actually believe that would happen? It's a difference between a government minister saying that there's an expectation that it will. Do you actually think it will happen, because it is crucial to the quality of the information that we have in terms of sharing it and to the help that we give to the youngster, that problem is sorted?
I mean, we are now going into the remit of professional practice as opposed to the terms of the order. But if I can just say to Liz Smith, in terms of the responsibilities I have as a minister and in terms of the agencies that I sponsor, that we'll continue to work on a daily basis, if need be, and give assurances and further information to committee to satisfy their concerns about what actually happens in practice. Professionals do have very clear responsibilities. I think it is appropriate that I state clearly my expectation in terms of people exercising those professional responsibilities, but the purpose of this order is for people to act upon the information that's shared.
Thank you. Liam.
Thank you. I welcome the clarity of the Minister's statement there and her expectation, but the order we're looking at today in section 3 here states Skills Development Scotland must provide to the persons listed in column 1 of schedule 2 to this order the information described in the corresponding entry in column 2 of that schedule which Skills Development Scotland holds about a young person. And it lists governing bodies of colleges of further education, education authorities, the Funding Council, Scottish ministers, governing bodies of colleges and education authorities. So it doesn't, I can't see where the latitude is there for SDS to have the sorts of conversations that I think you quite rightly have stated would be your expectation to see. So I'm struggling to know whether or not, even with those assurances, we're in a position to pass this order, because it doesn't appear to do what you would expect it to do.
With respect, Convener, I mean, this order is a very focused, quite discreet order that is about the sharing of information. I mean, we are, going into the areas of, professional practice. But I mean, this order, although very discreet and very specific about what information is shared with whom, when, it is very important, nonetheless, that we move forward with this order so that we can start to ensure that we have more consistent practice of sharing data, so that, because, one thing is for sure, while we are straying into areas of professional practice, we can't expect professionals to act if they don't actually have the information. So this order is quite discreet about sharing information, but it's very important, nuts and bolts of a system, ensuring that professionals can actually get the information that they need to act upon.
But with respect, we can't ask professionals or expect professionals to act where they don't have the latitude to act. And my concern is that you've quite clearly set out what your expectation would be. But in terms of the sharing of that information, it's difficult to see how somebody in SDS could have the sort of conversation either with housing officials or social work officials, as we've discussed, on the basis of the order we're about to pass. I mean, these may not be as numerous as the sorts of conversations that need to be had with the bodies outlined in column 1 of the order, but it's not, I think, beyond the realms of possibility that they are going to be required to act in those areas on occasion.
I mean, Kavira, I think I've been clear about, the purpose of this order and what is the responsibilities of professionals. But I will ask Ailsa Hain to add some comments.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying there's nothing in the order which then stops SDS taking these measures or taking action, speaking to local authorities, housing authorities. This order is, as the Minister has already explained, quite discreet in what it is trying to provide for is the provision of the information to SDS so that SDS has information upon which it can act. So all of the information listed in Schedule 1, which you've just referred to, that is information which is to be provided to SDS. And that is the bulk of this order. Less of it is concerned with the provision of information by SDS. That is
Sorry, with respect, the bit I read out came under a heading, provision of information by Skills Development Scotland.
Can I just say that refers to Schedule 2 of the order, not Schedule 1 of the order. So it's Schedule 2 sets out the information that Skills Development Scotland is to provide, and that is much more limited in the sense that it only provides information to colleges and to education authorities. And it's a much more restricted set of information because it's only in relation to providing information to those bodies who are providing the training or education so that they are aware in particular of support needs, that type of information. The information that's set out in Schedule 1 is information that has to be provided to Skills Development Scotland. And that is the bulk of the information. And they have that information upon which they can then act. But there's nothing in this order that deals with what SDS does in relation to intervening with the young person. That is beyond the scope of this order. And that would simply be within the current powers of SDS to intervene in relation to young persons. So in a sense, that work is going on at the moment. The SDS intervenes.
That's helpful. I think that clearing up that differentiation between what the order does and what the body does currently is helpful. Hopefully, Liam still looks puzzled. But anyway, we'll move on. We've got one final question from Claire Adamson.
Good morning, Minister. I think perhaps you may have answered my question in answering the questions about the pragmatic approach to the timescales, but it's really to do with the consultation, and obviously the consultation report was published in March, but did that consultation reveal any significant areas of concern, and if so, how were they resolved in the process?
Want to answer that, Gavin? Scott?
The principal areas that were covered, well, the feedback we got from the consultation was again about partners' issues around quality. So I think everybody was really keen to just understand how, through sharing this information, we could address those issues of quality. But there were no significant concerns about taking this forward. Everybody was really bought into it. It was more about how do we get it done.
Okay, thank you very much. We will now move on to agenda item 3. As indicated, can I invite the Minister to speak to and move the motion in her name?
Thank you, Convener. I move the motion in my name and I don't have any further comments to add.
Okay. Do members have any comments they wish to add at this stage? Liam MacArthur.
Just going back to the point I raised earlier during the debate about what would happen in relation to the data at the point at which a young person ceases to fall within the ambit of this order. I think I understood you to say, Minister, that the data would be disposed of appropriately, but then in response to questions from the convener, officials were indicating that where it was felt to be necessary for SDS to continue working with that individual, the order would simply cease to allow them to share that data with those listed in the schedule. So I'm slightly unclear as to what happens to the data. Does SDS simply retain that but stop sharing it, or does it dispose of it at the point at which a young person reaches the age of 25 and at that stage doesn't appear to be in need of engagement with SDS?
Are any other members wish to comment about this particular part of the debate? No? Does the Minister wish to respond?
SDS will retain information until there is no further use for it, and that's in terms of its compliance with the Data Protection Act.
Okay, thank you very much. I now put the question that motion S4M 09744 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not all agreed, therefore there will be a division. Can I ask for those members who wish to support the motion, please show. Okay, thank you. Those against? Abstentions? The result of the division is that the motion was agreed. There were 7 votes in favour, no votes against and 2 abstentions. Can I thank the Minister and our officials very much for coming along for the session this morning. It was very helpful. And I will now suspend briefly to allow a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. This is our third evidence session on our inquiry. Today we will cover the topics of broadcasting and culture, And to discuss the topic of broadcasting, can I welcome our first panel of witnesses to the meeting. We have Bobby Hayne, Director of Channels at Scottish Television, Paul Holleran, Scottish Organiser at NUJ Scotland, Jeremy Peat, former member of the BBC Trust, and Rosina Robson, Head of Policy, Producers Alliance for Cinema and Television. Thank you all very much for coming along this morning and for your written submissions as well. Can I move straight to questions? What I want to start with is a question directed at yourself, Mr Hayne, representing STV. Obviously, we had the BBC give some evidence. The BBC have declined to appear this morning, I have to say, but they gave some evidence some weeks ago. And during that evidence session, we asked them specifically about the research that was undertaken by Professor Robertson of the University of West of Scotland. Can I ask, you'll have seen that evidence, I'm sure, and you'll have seen the research. Can I ask you to respond to the research that was produced by Professor Robertson and his colleagues, and specifically some of the numbers that were produced, which certainly to some people showed that both BBC and STV provided more information for the no side of the independence referendum campaign than was balanced out by contributions from the yes side?
Yes, good morning and thank you, and I'm very happy to give a response on the question of the research. I might make 3 points which would give you hopefully some detail on the research itself and our consideration of it. I should say up front that we welcome scrutiny of what we do. We're a public service broadcaster. It's absolutely crucial to our performance within the terms of our licence, within the legislation and the regulation in which we operate, and indeed for the trust of the audience that what we do is balanced, fair, accurate and impartial. I've met with Professor Robertson. We're very interested in his research and exactly the methodology which we've not seen before, which is new, and understanding exactly how he has examined our output. I should say that the examination of the output appears to be centred around our evening bulletins at 6 o'clock. And that represents around about 25% of our total output. So although it is quite a large body of work across a year, it is not a comprehensive view of STV's output in terms of its news bulletins, either on our other services around the country at other times of day, or indeed our current affairs output, which is also under consideration in terms of impartiality as far as Scotland Tonight is concerned, which is on at 10:30 every evening. So it's about a quarter of what it is that we do. The first point I would make is that we have a very committed and dedicated staff who absolutely have editorial compliance running through their DNA. We have 120 talented professional journalists who make our programmes every single day, and it's absolutely part of our process to arrive at a reasonable and fair treatment for every story that we produce. I think the second point is that there is a very clear set of references and terms of reference within our licence, which is overseen by Ofcom. Not only is there explicit information as to how and what we must do by way of impartiality in the licence itself, there is the Ofcom code, which we must adhere to, and there is also the notes of guidance which Ofcom issue, which give further information around compliance and the treatment of stories and the inclusion of material in our stories. And the third point I would make is that we have 3 million people in Scotland every month who watch STV News and Current Affairs. And we invite their views too on the stories that we create and that we produce and transmit, and indeed on what they think about our output. And of all the comments and the inquiries and the feedback that we get, actually we have a very small number of actual complaints about the way our programmes are framed, about the individual stories. And of those complaints, which we are duty-bound to point to the regulator if we can't resolve ourselves, and the vast majority we do, literally a handful of complaints a year go to Ofcom, the regulator, and during that period none was entertained around the question of impartial or unfair treatment within stories. So I think although the research is interesting, and although it's important for us to engage with it and be curious about it, it's not corroborated by the actual performance of STV within the terms of its licence, nor indeed the response of viewers themselves who watch this material every single evening.
Thank you very much. You said that you met Professor Robertson. Can I just clarify? Did you mean that you'd you just happened to have met Professor Robertson along the way, or was that a specific response to his research?
Well, it so happened that I was at the University of the West of Scotland in Ayr on another matter and took the chance to meet Professor Robertson, who is based there. And of course, I'm curious about the research because, as I say, there isn't a lot of this research around, and it is a new methodology and it is a new piece of work, and indeed I understand it's ongoing. So I think it's very important for us to understand what this research is, how it's come about, and what it tells us about impartiality and about the perception of stories by not just academics, but the wider public too.
But it was your meeting of Professor Robertson was in response to his publication?
Indeed, yes.
Yes, I asked specifically because there was clearly Professor Robertson was extremely upset about the response that he received from the BBC when he gave evidence to this committee. So I was just trying to make clear about what the response of STV had been to his research. Do you not accept any of the numbers that he gave at all? You've said quite clearly that you've looked at it, it's interesting, you've met with him, but there was not. You then balanced that out by saying that effectively the number of complaints you had were not particularly high, and therefore, I think by implication you were saying therefore there wasn't a problem. Do you not accept any of the numbers at all in Professor Robertson's research, which clearly showed along all the categories an imbalance between the yes and the no campaign in terms of what was being broadcast? Yeah, I accept on a particular programme. And in particular, one of the ones that stands out in my mind was the personalisation of the campaigns, or rather, one side of the campaign, the yes campaign being about the First Minister, and the no campaign being about a general broad grouping.
Well, I think that we have to take some caution in looking at what these numbers actually mean. And by that I mean that, as I said to you, the body of work that we've seen represents around 25% of the total of what we transmit across that period. It's limited, I think, to the 2.5 hours a week of peak time news in STV Central West. We have another programme in the East. We have 2 programmes that go out in the North, which are differentiated by news for Dundee. And of course, we have Scotland Tonight and other ad hoc current affairs programmes across the piece. So it is not a comprehensive study of what STV has transmitted in the time period. At the point where the research is down to, I think it's about 10 pages or so, with the data charts and some of the examples brought out, you're at the very tip of the iceberg, if you like, of what STV actually transmits as a whole body of work. And I think I would urge caution in reading into any individual instance, because by its very nature, it's only a snippet of what it is that we do. And I think that the way we approach our compliance is that in the context of every story, every bulletin, every point of transmission, is the context of that story reasonable? Is the story being told in a way that's fair and accurate? And does it constitute an accurate and fair presentation for the viewer? And as I say, everyone is free at any point to comment and feedback on our output, and this is not a line of criticism that we've seen up until now.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. Mr Hayne, you've provided a fairly diplomatic response. Obviously, you will have heard BBC's evidence when they were before this committee. And in terms of accepting of the numbers, it wasn't simply BBC that wasn't accepting of the numbers in Professor Robertson's initial report. Actually, Professor Robertson himself held his hands up and said that some of the figures produced initially were wrong. Do you share some of those misgivings that the BBC had pointed out to the committee, and I think had pointed out to Professor Robertson as well, both about the accuracy of some of the assertions that were made in that report, and actually the recalibration of the numbers of hours of output that were initially proposed, but then were amended subsequent to Professor Robertson appearing before the committee?
I think what is at the heart of this analysis, and any analysis that's similar to it, is that it requires some degree of subjectivity in the coding. So you start with counting all the minutes and the stories, and then you apply filters to those and put them into one box or the other, and then from those boxes you make some conclusions. I think what then happens is people talk only about the conclusions and without going back and investigating all of the raw data. And as I say, this is not a methodology that we've seen, then it's not for me to say how good the data is. I haven't seen the raw data. It's not data we collect in the form that it's presented, and therefore it's not easy or indeed possible across the time span for me to compare Professor Robertson's analysis and the raw data against any other methodology, because it's not a methodology we've seen before.
I mean, there is a risk here, because while you say it's new, a new way of gathering data and trying to assess and analyse output in this way. But nevertheless, there has been a fair amount of publicity around this report, if not initially then when Professor Robertson appeared before the committee, and yet without anybody really being able to analyse the data, we're having these assertions being made and accusations levelled at both STV and BBC about the quality and partiality of their output in relation to the referendum, which I think to many people who do not necessarily follow the detail of the deliberations in this committee will be taken at face value and taken as a fair reflection of your outputs. I would have thought there must have been a real incentive for you and for the BBC to demand of Professor Robertson that raw data on which he's made some fairly serious and damaging accusations.
Well, I don't think it's for us to do that, in all honesty. I think our obligations are very clearly framed in our licence. We adhere to those. I think as a public service broadcaster, it's absolutely right and proper that we do that. We are open to scrutiny and we welcome scrutiny. But I think in terms of the regulatory goalposts, if you like, they're very clearly established, and that's what we adhere to. And equally, we constantly take soundings from our audience. And I'm absolutely confident that from the response of the audience through the same period, which I do have a very detailed and exhaustive list of, every call, every email, every inquiry, I can point to an audience reaction which is not similarly worried about the output as described by the professor's work. So I think in terms of our priorities, they are the terms of our licence and the response of our audience. George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to ask Paul Holleran a question. When the BBC were here...
Just before, is everybody... There's nobody else wants to ask questions about directly on this Professor Robertson's evidence? Just because I didn't start to... This was a very specific thing because we've done the BBC before. If we're finished with that, then by all means. Okay, sorry, George.
I'd like to ask Paul Holleran. When the BBC were here, it's unfortunate they're not here today as well, but when they were here previously, I asked about staff, journalists that they have currently with the current challenges that they face, and they told me they had higher a number of journalists than they'd had in the past. In fact, at one stage, I think they said than they'd ever had. Is that hyperbole? Is that true? What is the current situation, Mr Holleran?
Obviously, our members in the BBC across Scotland were watching the evidence that was given by BBC management. I think it's most unfortunate that they're not here to have a shared platform on this. But it would be fair to say that most of the staff that I spoke to afterwards did not recognise the reality of what the BBC management said. At the moment, there are major problems in respect to industrial relations in the BBC. I'm in a process of trying to get a meeting with Ken Macquarie to try and sort these things out. He said he's an open door policy, but we're having major problems. I'm just back from the Middle East. I spent 4 days working with Palestine authorities, Palestine Broadcasting Corporation and the Palestinian Journalists Union. We made more progress in those 4 days than we have done in the BBC Scotland in the last 4 months. And that gives you an example of how difficult it is at the moment. The main problems is the cuts that they made last year, front-loading redundancies at a time when really they should have been expanding. We're not certain of how they're spending the money, the £5 million. We certainly don't see, or my members don't see, an expansion of jobs in the BBC. And the replacements that they talked about were not new jobs. You know, I believe they talked about Lucy Adams coming from the Herald, which Lucy Adams is a very good reporter and thinks she'd be a great asset to the BBC. But she was there to replace Raymond Buchanan. They talked about Laura Becker being moved into a more senior political position. Her position has not been replaced in News and Current Affairs. I have shop stewards and fathers of our chapel who are having difficulty getting time off for union business, being refused time off, having to take holidays to do their business because there's insufficient staff. On GMS, Good Morning Scotland, this time last year there were 7 senior broadcast journalists on the rota. At the moment, there are 3. There are major difficulties, and that has some impact on people providing quality products. I have no doubt about that.
So just to confirm, you don't recognise the fact that they say they've got a higher amount of journalists than what they had previously then?
Our committee, our union committee said, their words were to paraphrase one of the senior members of management was, we do not recognise that as reality.
Okay, because they made quite a big thing about it when I asked. They then went on to say that when I further pushed them, it was more, there was quite a few trainee staff that were part of the independence referendum unit. Now, are these possibly the staff that they're talking about? Where I think they were on a 2-year contract and the trainee does 3 years or something like that?
Well, there are apprentices within BBC Scotland, so I'm not sure if you're talking about that. But in News and Current Affairs, they set up an independence referendum unit. It appears as though there's difficulties in that area. There seems to be a dysfunctioning in management areas. In respect to the trainees, they're all very capable young people. We're not too sure whether they've been used properly. In 1 or 2 cases, they've been used to fill gaps in rotas and do jobs that maybe took some of the senior members of staff by surprise.
See, when I asked that question, I was told quite categorically that the trainees that were attached to the independence referendum unit were actually, that was what they were working on all the time, because I did ask about whether they were used to cover gaps elsewhere, and you're saying that probably is the case, because I was told by the BBC management that that wasn't the case.
Well, I know for a fact that they weren't working totally on independence referendum team. There was obviously needed to be an induction period where they were introduced into how the BBC worked and how some of them worked on different departments, and that would make sense so that they get used to operations from the BBC. But I can assure you some of them have been used to act as a stopgap in other areas.
Just on an issue that we've already talked about, Professor Robertson's evidence that he gave to us. There was also a case that some of these trainees, and they actually said it, management said it, that they were used to actually go through Mr Robertson's evidence. Now, would that be a normal thing for a trainee journalist to do when they're obviously embarking in their career in journalism?
Under work experience, I suppose that people are given various jobs to do to try and broaden their knowledge. But if it was done as an exercise in assessing the investigation, I would have thought that would not be appropriate, to be honest with you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Mr Holland, could I just ask you about the accuracy of the information that you believe is available? I remember on this committee 2 years ago, I think it was, when the convener at that time asked some very searching questions of both sides in the BBC dispute about the accuracy of the information that was available when it came to employment. Do you believe that there is accurate information out there that this committee, whether we agree with your position or with the management of the BBC, that we can use to drill down on the trends of the statistics?
I believe it is out there. It's whether we can find it and in whose head it is in.
My next question was, how do we find it?
Well, we're in the same position as you. The NUJ have been heavily criticised to our faces and behind our back by a variety of managers in the BBC for being too political in this situation, which I find it quite unfortunate. So people trying to tell me how to do my job. We work on an industrial front. We work there on a day-to-day basis. But we also have to take legal action occasionally, but also political pressure is essential to accountability of the media in the NUJ's view, and working with the politicians we think is part and parcel of our work. And we would argue that while politicians should be kept at arm's length from editorial independence, issues like this in respect to resources is essential. And I would say while we've had conversations about how the £5 million has been spent that was returned to BBC Scotland from previous cuts which were made in BBC Scotland, there wasn't new money that was returned to help fund the independence referendum team. I think it would be fair to say there's a lack of transparency amongst the workforce and certainly amongst the union on the whole area and where the money's been spent.
And if we accept your view that there is a lack of transparency and we try to do something about that, do you then believe that there would be a difference in the interpretation of the statistics that are available?
I suppose our position is that we try and take a straight line on this and say to BBC management, we expect you to stand by your policies and BBC policies. Part of our complaint to Mr Macquarie at this meeting that we're trying to organise will be that those policies are being breached on a number of areas. It's something that we need to deal with. Obviously, a number of them are confidential, but the whole question of editorial independence, and when someone makes a programme and it's signed off by their managers, should there be then further interference? So there are issues like that we are trying to get around the table with them. In February, we were promised a series of meetings to deal with 6 or 7 specific grievances. They still haven't been dealt with.
Okay.
So there's problems.
I accept that. I mean, obviously, these are contractual discussions that you need to have with the BBC Scotland. But from our scrutiny aspect and from the public's perspective, do you believe that there is a set of statistics that would be, that if you were to interpret these statistics, that both the BBC management and yourselves would agree on the correct way to interpret them?
It's difficult to know. We've asked for specific details, and they don't seem to exist except in some certain people's heads. And we've tried to pin them down to say, can we look at the breakdown of how the money's been spent, what jobs have been created, how are they working? At the moment, we're just trying to firefight by filling gaps, making sure that gaps are filled in the day-to-day operations. I think it'd be fair to say there wouldn't be agreement between the BBC management and ourselves on interpretation, whatever is arrived at in respect to how those vacancies have been filled or should be filled.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Vera. This is probably a question really for Mr Hayne. I'd be interested in hearing more about the SDV commitment to the referendum. The programme, what programmes are being produced? The road to the referendum, of course, was well advertised and I think well received. Is there a specific budget allocation, a specific number of hours allocated? I'd be interested just to hear about the approach to this.
Of course. I think the mainstay and the backbone of our current affairs coverage, which will increasingly be given over almost exclusively to referendum affairs, is Scotland Tonight, which would normally take a summer break in line with most current affairs programming when parliaments are in recess. In fact, we'll be staying on over the summer so that we cover the lead up to the referendum. We have special programming planned, which is not quite confirmed yet in terms of dates and so on, but we are about to make a further announcement about a raft of programming in the lead up to the referendum itself, and preparations for covering the day of the coverage in terms of the through the night coverage as announcements are made and results come in will result in one of the biggest operations that we've ever mounted, with multiple live sources and so on and so forth. We don't disclose details of programming budgets per se, but this is a significant commitment and represents a large number of hours within our overall portfolio of programming for our Scottish material this year.
Would it be correct to say that you're putting, for want of a better word, new money against the referendum? In other words, additional funding and resources that are being provided there?
Yes, that's the case, absolutely.
Can you give any indication of additional resources in terms of people, reporters, that are going into this particular aspect?
Well, we have a very strong team already. As I say, we carry 120 journalists around the country. We have a dedicated team for Scotland Tonight. We have additional people coming on for our city service, which launches in the summer on June the 2nd for Glasgow. We also have a very strong online presence. So we will be using the existing resource, and our additional investment will include additional people and indeed additional resources by way of live links, satellite trucks, studio production and so on and so forth.
I mentioned previously the programme Road to Referendum. Is there any plans to update that?
We are looking at an updated version of Road to Referendum. One of the challenges we have is it's a very busy schedule across the summer. We lead into the World Cup and then we go into the Commonwealth Games. And although we do have a lot of time on the former, and we're not covering the latter, it's in the domain of the BBC in terms of rights, it is awkward to try and get into our schedule. If we can find space, we will update and transmit the programme. And in any case, I'm hopeful that it will find a home on the new STV Glasgow service.
Do you have a figure on how many extra hours are going to be broadcast in terms of the referendum? I say additional in terms of your current news production.
Well, we certainly will see an uplift in terms of hours across the year, and normally we would be regulated, if you like, to provide a minimum of 39 hours in peak time with another 39 hours somewhere around the rest of the schedule, which is a 78-hour minimum total. We will be significantly in excess of that this year, and a lot of that will be material that finds a home on Scotland Tonight, for example, and will, by its nature, be dedicated referendum coverage.
Okay, thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to broaden out a little more in terms of the purpose of looking at the potential implications of the outcome of that referendum rather than the lead up to it. I think looking through the written evidence that PACT provided, I think it would be fair to say that the white paper hasn't necessarily answered all the questions that you had. Indeed, it's probably set one or two hairs running as well. It's talked about the future of co-production treaties in the event of a yes vote, the UK network financing, the regulatory regime that would be in place, the impact of a Scottish broadcasting service on the other broadcasters, Channel 4, other licensees. There's a range of questions there. Have you made any progress in getting answers to some of those? I suspect some of them are probably unanswerable at this stage, but some of them presumably would merit a degree of reassurance and evidence that some of the concerns your members have are being addressed.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to answer questions this morning. I think certainly, as you say, the white paper does pose as many questions as it does provide answers, and I think there are a number of areas where I think we've outlined in our written submission that members are looking for some clarity around some of the fundamental questions for the independent production sector around whether terms of trade will continue under the existing Communications Act, whether Scottish production companies in Scotland would still qualify under the indie definition in England as well. But I think members do see a certain amount of opportunity through the introduction of a Scottish broadcasting service, and for that Scottish broadcasting service to become a publisher broadcaster, opening out more opportunities for the independent sector through a competitive and open market, and offering more opportunities for independent companies to exploit for a greater diversity and more innovative programming for the viewer as well.
In terms of the regulatory regime, I think within your evidence you talk about different options that have been mooted, either retaining within Ofcom, having a ScotCom or some kind of hybrid. I think in relation to ScotCom there seems to be a reference to a fear of PACT members of political interference with the regulator. Why would that be any more likely in relation to a Scottish regulator, if you like, than it is at a UK level currently?
Well, I think in terms of the regulator, there's a certain amount of information in the public domain about what could possibly happen after independence, and whether or not some or an aspect of the function that Ofcom is currently providing would form part of the combined economic regulator that's been outlined, or whether it be a separate regulator. We have been having discussions with the Scottish Government, but obviously there are a number of sort of aspects of the detail that are still to be worked out. And I think in principle terms, I think what we're particularly aware of is that such a regulator obviously should be independent. But also that if there were to be a separate regulator, that they should work closely with Ofcom in order to exchange, expertise and resources as necessary. But working in a sort of constructive collaboration. So I think those two principles are what we're most keen to see. Whatever happens post September.
And in terms of the co-production treaties, could you perhaps explain a little of the background of how those work? And you seem to indicate that those wouldn't automatically transfer in the event of independence. They would require a subsequent negotiation that I think you suggest could be not straightforward and could take some time.
Yes, this is one area where we've held 2 meetings so far with members based in Scotland. One fairly soon after the white paper was published, and one more recently. And this is one of the areas where they've raised and said that there's such value at the moment in a number of co-production treaties. I think there are a number of about 10, sort of both in Europe and worldwide, that offer, you know, a very good framework for businesses to work with their international counterparts on co-production. And I guess a little bit similar to the debate around EU membership, there will be an element of negotiation involved in post-independence and making sure that these international treaties still apply. And there'll obviously be an element of time between when that negotiation starts and finished. There'll be a period of uncertainty for independent companies not necessarily covered by the treaties in the meantime. And obviously for a sector that certainly over the last 10 years has grown year on year, it's currently worth UK-wide sort of 2.8 billion, and exports continue to grow, which is obviously important to the Scottish economy as well. TV exports about over 1.2 million now. It's a very important part of what the independent sector has to offer, and something, you know, we need to make sure is underpinned by these co-production treaties as well.
If I could maybe just briefly ask Jeremy Peat, in terms of the white paper, not necessarily in relation to the independent sector, but from your background within the BBC, we've heard suggestions this week that as well as establishing an SBS, we'd simply have access to current BBC output, either because nobody can stop the television waves transmitting across the border, or simply because we would arrive at some agreement. What is your assessment as to what is likely to happen in the event of a yes vote, particularly with regard to the establishment of SBS and how that would operate alongside BBC output?
It's difficult to give a short answer to that question, but essentially, so far as the access to BBC services is concerned post-independence, my understanding is that DTT, digital terrestrial television, could be cut off close to the border, so that there may be some marginal overlap, but essentially there could be a removal of access for the great majority of Scotland to that television. And already, so far as the iPlayer is concerned and the web is concerned, for countries out with the UK, there is a requirement to pay for access and a somewhat different services provided. So I would assume that the starting point would be that those services, again, would be available to Scotland as an independent nation in a different way from the way they are at the moment, for payment and potentially a different service. So far as satellite is concerned, and indeed cable, I would assume there, and Bobby Hayne may know this far better than I do, but that I would assume that access could continue, but it would be for the satellite and cable broadcasters to determine how access to those services was achieved, and whether this was free or at payment. I understand that in the case of Ireland, there is access to the majority of BBC services, but I think that the phrase that is used is that it is on a commercial basis, without any clarity as precisely what that commercial basis might be. So I don't think there can be the presumption that access would continue on a free and unfettered basis to all services. I think for Freeview and the like, there would initially be means of truncating the service. For satellite and cable, other ways, other decisions would be required. So I think this is all very difficult to determine what happens in advance. My reading of the white paper is that the proposal is that the licence fee plus some share of BBC assets, including BBC Worldwide assets, should be allocated to Scotland. And Scotland would then wish to set up a joint venture arrangement with the BBC, whereby they would continue to provide the value of programming that they provide at the moment, and in exchange for that, the BBC would then allow free access to BBC services for Scotland. Now that strikes me as an arrangement that would require a great deal of negotiation. First of all, to determine what share of assets would be appropriate, and secondly, to determine whether the BBC, as remained, would see it a fair deal to provide free access to the whatever the price is, the value is of the services that would be required for the cost of the services, the programming provided from within Scotland. That would be a matter of negotiation, a matter of discussion. And Marcia Miller, the Culture Secretary, has stated publicly that access would not be permitted post-independence. So I understand the principle, but I think there's an awful lot of issues to be discussed and debated before such an arrangement could be implemented. And then there's the question of whether the sum of money that would come from the licence fee, less the programming delivered to the BBC, would be sufficient to deliver a quality service through the Scottish Broadcasting Service, and what that might be. So may I just add one other point, Convener?
Briefly, yes,
which is in relation to all the questions about impartiality and the like that have been raised. May I just remind the committee that the BBC Trust has sole responsibility for impartiality and accuracy, and indeed for oversight of public service broadcasting in all issues. So if there are questions through the report from Professor Robertson or elsewhere regarding impartiality, etc., those are matters for the BBC Trust. I have read the evidence the BBC gave on the Robertson report. I'm not in a position to comment either on his methodology or the accuracy of his work, and I've read how upset the BBC clearly were, BBC Scotland clearly were. But I just remind the committee that the responsibility for impartiality is vested solely in the BBC Trust. They will have signed off the arrangements for broadcasting in the run-up to the referendum, as they have done over the years in the run-up to elections, and they are responsible for ensuring that any such arrangements are followed and followed appropriately. So if there are uncertainties that remain, then I think those are for the BBC Trust, and it's for your consideration how, although the Trust does not report to this Parliament formally, how you might wish to engage with the BBC Trust in seeking any further commentary that you require.
Thank you very much for that. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. On a couple of the points that Liam MacArthur raised already, in terms of independent production opportunities, the management review that came out from the BBC for 2012-13 suggested that local television arts, there was 10 hours of arts programme originating from Scotland, 10 hours of comedy, 3 hours of entertainment, 12 hours of factual entertainment, and 13 hours of music performance. And since 2008 to 2012, the number of television production companies have reduced from 35 to 24. So the establishment of a Scottish broadcasting service, would that not create more opportunities for your sector rather than less in Scotland?
I think members see it both ways, and as I mentioned before, there are opportunities if the SBS was set up as a publisher broadcaster to open out more opportunities to the open market to drive efficiency and drive innovation. And I think certainly the sector over the last 10 years has demonstrated that it can deliver across a range of genre and you know, prove to be a very sort of agile and dynamic sector.
You would agree there would be more opportunities for your members in Scotland if there was a separate SBS established?
I think to a certain extent, yes. I think members are very aware that so far the sector's done a very good job of producing content that's both relevant to Scotland, but also the UK network and also internationally as well. And I think that's the basis that members are very keen that continues in the future as well.
And in terms of STV's situation, a number of years ago, STV made the decision not to broadcast some of the network programmes and to produce your own homegrown programmes to replace those gaps in the schedule. How popular was that decision and how did it stack up financially?
Well, it certainly was an important move at the time when we were in dispute with ITV about the terms of our network arrangements which underpin how our services work together. And I'm pleased to say that we're very much beyond that point in terms of our commercial arrangements with ITV and enjoy a much better relationship with ITV. I think that on a programme-by-programme case, if you look at the evidence at the time, some programmes were very popular with viewers in Scotland, some not so popular. I think what we have been able to do from that experience is absolutely define a balance where we have the network programming that is very high budget and expected to be enjoyed across the transmission area as a whole, across the whole UK. But equally, we do recognise the importance and the value of providing Scottish content. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier on, we're not returning to the bare minimum of programming required under our licences. Actually, we will be in excess of that. And that is because there's a commercial basis on which we can do so.
Okay. Finally, on the point, before I move on to my own questions that I've got, on the point of access to BBC One and BBC Two, etc., is there an arrangement between the situation in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland between what is broadcast in the Republic of Ireland and broadcast in Northern Ireland?
My understanding is that there is such an arrangement, that a commercial agreement has been entered into whereby there is sharing of access, at least in large parts of Ireland. And of course, in the border areas, just as there would be in Scotland, it is impossible to cut off the service precisely at the border. So there is an overlap, but in addition, there is a commercial agreement that has been entered into.
There was an agreement in 2010 between the Irish and Westminster governments to say that BBC One and BBC Two could be broadcast free to air throughout the whole of the Republic of Ireland. And in addition, in Northern Ireland, RTE1 and RTE2 would be shown in Northern Ireland. And that would be free to air or on the Sky platform.
That you are better informed than I am as to the precise details, but I'm sure there was such an agreement. But that doesn't necessarily apply to BBC Three, BBC Four.
BBC Three is going off air, but
sorry, but it doesn't necessarily apply to all the services on a free-to-air and free-to Ireland basis. There is some form of commercial undertaking in place, the precise nature of which I don't know, but again, that arrangement between Westminster and Dublin was an agreement that was negotiated rather than one that just happened.
Yeah. Moving on to my own questions about the establishment of a Scottish broadcasting service. Does anybody have an opinion of what size of budget would be required in order to do that? Bearing in mind that we start with the current position, and on a normal broadcasting situation, they'll broadcast for roughly 8,700 hours, something like that, and roughly 60%, if you look at RTE, is homegrown. The rest is bought in or repeats. So any idea of what sort of size of budget would be required to do
that? Well, I think the question epitomises the difficulty we're in. Until there is a dialogue that starts between all the broadcasters, including packed but independent companies, commercial companies, and the BBC, and political groups, groupings like this, until we get that dialogue going and get into the nitty-gritty of what that will entail, then I think most people are in the dark, and we can only clutch at straws. And we end up having discussions where people start making unhelpful suggestions that everything's going to be cut off at the border. And I think the STV and ITV have made a clear example when they were in a very difficult situation a number of years ago, and they negotiated a really mutually beneficial deal at the end of it. And we need to get into those discussions now at the earliest possible stage. And I know previous meetings here, this committee, BBC, I think it was Mark Thompson, who was Director General at the time, refused to engage in any suggestion about having discussions that might look at what a future BBC might look at, or Scottish Broadcasting Corporation, because he felt as though it was impinging on their independence, role of independence in respect to independent journalism. But I do think that dialogue needs to take place. If people can have to then make their mind up in respect to what kind of broadcasting corporation will be in existence. From our point of view, regardless of the outcome of the independence referendum, something needs to be done, particularly with BBC, because it's not sustainable at the moment.
If I could just briefly comment. I mean, I gave evidence to the Blair Jenkins review, I think 6 or 8 times when I was Governor and then Trustee for Scotland, and I think we did engage fully in that inquiry and went on. So I hope that that was supportive of the examination. So far as the sums that would be required, I believe that the funds that would be available to a Scottish Broadcasting Service from the licence fee, less the amount of provision of programming by Scotland to the BBC, would be something in the order of £250 million per year. Now, what that would then provide, others are better placed to argue than I am, but the proposal is that it would start off with an additional BBC television programme, an additional SBS television programme, and then subsequently be followed by a radio programme. Now, the sums that are involved in that 250 million are, of course, substantially less than the cost of providing BBC One or BBC Two, but substantially ahead of those of providing BBC Alapa. Now, the question is what type of television service would be required, for how long, the extent of drama programmes, which are very expensive, the extent of other programming, the extent of bought-in. One could look at the example in Ireland where a channel is provided on a low-cost figure, but is that the type of channel that the Scottish Broadcasting Service would provide or people would wish it to provide? So the sums involved would be relatively limited compared to the cost of providing the channels that the BBC at the moment provides, but the discussion would then be as to what was wanted and the cost and how that could be made efficiently, and at the same time provide all the opportunities to the creative sector in Scotland, which is clearly an important part of the whole equation. It's not just a matter of providing services to viewers and listeners in Scotland. It is providing a means of enhancing the creative sector, which has great potential for exporting and development of value added in Scotland. Would it be enough money to do all that? Please discuss. I think it's a big question, and it's quite an ask on the sum of money that is on the table, as I understand it.
Looking at RTE, which is the only example we have out with the BBC of a public sector broadcaster, their latest accounts for 2012 suggested that for 272 million, they provided 2 TV stations and 4 radio stations. In terms of popularity of programmes, 19 of the 20 were homegrown, and in terms of popularity of television stations, BBC One and BBC Two came 4th and 5th.
That's very encouraging then.
Absolutely. And now the licence fee, my understanding is the licence fee that's raised in Scotland is the region of £320 to £325 million, of which currently £102 million comes back to Scotland, and that is in the process of being cut by £16 million by 2016.
Well, the latest figures I've seen are 320 million, the approximate figure for the licence fee that is raised, because unfortunately there are no accurate figures. There are figures about the number of licence fee payers, but not about the extent to which there are subsidised licence fee payers. So that's the estimate of the sums, but the latest estimate of expenditure is 175 million in Scotland. So that is the gap as I understand it. And then, of course, this 95 million figure that I quoted was the current level of network TV programming provided by Scotland, which it is stated would continue to be provided as part of this agreement with the BBC to then permit the continued transmission of other BBC services in Scotland on a free basis. So that's why I deducted that 95 million from the 320 million and gave a slightly bullish estimate of 250. It probably comes out at 225 if my maths is correct. So that's the figure we're talking about.
In terms of...
Sorry, Gordon. I think Paul Halderman wanted to come in.
Just to respond to some of your questions there, I think one of the things NUJ are doing at the moment, we've just started a process where we are looking at one of the issues we're looking at in respect to future broadcasting is funding models as well. You were saying there about RTE being a comparator. Our view is that we need to maybe look at a number of options looking at future funding. And we've commissioned someone at the moment to do some work in that field. I think we should start obviously with comparators, but there also needs to be an element of white paper attached to it to look at how exactly what kind of news coverage, news and cultural programme making that we require in future. And I think that the dialogue needs to start as soon as possible. But I don't think we should just go down one route.
Just briefly on the point about the budget, I would just say that obviously the viewer will continue to demand continuity in quality from what the Scottish public have been used to in the past, but also there's obviously cost attached to buying quite expensive high-end drama through UK commissions like Sherlock, produced by independent companies that will, the viewer will demand into the future. So certainly there are cost implications attached to that.
There's no reason why that couldn't be done as a joint venture. The same as BBC has joint ventures with other countries abroad. Mm-hmm. My last question was about commissioning costs for various types of television programmes. Would I be right in saying that it's actually cheaper to produce a programme out with the London area? I saw numbers for the BBC commissioning rates, and I might have misunderstood them, but it suggested that BBC programmes established centrally for, say, drama was up to £900,000 per hour. However, if it was done in the nations or the English regions, which is their reference, it was up to £450,000 an hour. And in terms of comedy, again, the starting figure was £110,000 an hour for network hours for independent producers. But for the regions and the nations, it would be something like a starting figure of £50,000. So costs would be substantially lower. Is there a reason for that? And would that suggest that we could get the quality of programming but at a lower cost?
Well, I think it's sort of no secret that production expenses can be obviously lower outside the M25. And I think there's a lot of progress just in terms of quotas and spend in Scotland. There's been a lot of progress made over the last few years, certainly from the BBC and Channel 4 and others in terms of investment in Scotland. So, certainly we'd be keen to see that continuity and that continue into the future. That level of commitment, anyway.
Right, sorry, can I just follow this up? Because I was interested in the numbers in terms of the commissioning costs, because PACT in their evidence supplied a table which depends how you interpret everything, of course. Numbers are always very interesting, but you seem to be suggesting that, of course, the number of commissions in the UK is 47, the value of commissions is just over 42 million, therefore the average value for commission is just under £900,000. It's in your paper. And yet, for local, I presume that means, Scotland, I presume. Is that what you mean by local?
Yes, yeah.
It's 360,000 is the average value of commission. That's in the context of you trying to suggest that somehow Scotland would drive towards niche programming and there would be a brain drain from Scotland to London. Why on earth would we do that? Why on earth would we go down some sort of niche? Sounds like a dead end to me.
Well, the table comes from a report that was done for Scottish Enterprise in 2012, and it's one part of the picture because I think it was based on a survey of a certain number of companies. But it demonstrates that the UK commissions have a lot more value, and I think some of the feelings have been.
Sorry, that's the point I'm trying to drive to. I'm glad you've got to very early, but. Does it show that they have more value, or does it show that they're more expensive?
Well, that they would be more costly to purchase. I mean, I think one of the things that's been coming out in the conversations we've been having with members is that they're keen to see, whatever happens post September, a continuation of programming that's attractive to a local Scottish audience, a UK audience, and an international audience as well. And I think some companies that perhaps the UK companies have got a presence around the UK, would potentially think twice about having, presence in Scotland if, if an independence was to happen.
Why?
Because in terms of the programming that might then result post-independence.
So where does that come from?
Well, I'm merely reflecting views that have been expressed by a number of members.
I'm trying to understand the evidence base for the assertions that you've made both in your paper and you've just made there a moment ago. That somehow we would, end up in a situation where broadcasting in Scotland post-independence would somehow be a sort of niche dead end that would be low value, low quality, which seems to be what you're suggesting, and therefore people wouldn't want to be here. What's the evidence for that?
Well, I think there are two sides to the story, and I think we've been very open in listening to a variety of views from the membership, and I think what I've articulated today are also the opportunities that come from independence as well. So I think what I'm here to say today is that we see that there are both opportunities and threats to some of the proposals that have been put forward so far, and also a number of question marks over a number of areas of policies that have been articulated so far that we would like to see more answers to.
You do accept that nobody's suggesting that we do what would result in a brain drain or people not wanting to produce work here. I mean, nobody's suggesting that, are they?
Well, it would be a fear from some parts of the independent sector that they may see that the more attractive opportunities in producing UK-wide programming south of the border.
So, but I'm still trying to get to the bottom of where that comes from, though, because as we've already agreed that it's much more expensive to produce these programmes in London or the South East, and yet you can produce the same programme with the same value, the same quality, same number of hours for a lot less if you go elsewhere, accepting the English regions as part of that equation. And I'm trying to understand why you're suggesting that anybody, because I don't know anybody who's suggesting that post-independence we would head down a route that would cause us to be some sort of backwater in terms of broadcasting.
I didn't suggest that, but it's I mean, I think what I want to say is that there will be, there are opportunities and threats from independence, and a number of questions that still remain to be answered. And we're representing members based both in Scotland with UK companies with a Scottish base and companies with bases all around the UK. And the reality is that for the Scottish viewer, having access to some of the programmes that they've had access to so far, the underlying rights in some cases will be owned by independent companies, and there may well be negotiations and costs attached to having those programmes available to them post-independence.
Okay. Mr. Peat, you stated earlier, or you mentioned this idea that programmes would be blocked at the border, which I think was Maria Miller, the Westminster Culture Secretary, came up and tried to scare us with that particular story. You do accept that on the day that she said that, or the week that she suggested that we wouldn't get access to Doctor Who, it was broadcast, I think it was over 50 or was it over 70 countries around the world. Do you think that's a really, I mean, is that the kind of story tenable in any reasonable person's view?
I have no idea what the outcome of negotiations would be, and I was not saying that services would be blocked. What I said was DTT could be blocked, and that in the only example I have looked at, which is Ireland, and looked at it very briefly, that there was a commercial arrangement before the access was provided. Now,
it's free to air on both sides of the border.
Yes, I take that point. So all I'm saying is that, as is set out in the White Paper, there would have to be an agreement reached as to continuing access being provided and on what basis, and with what quid pro quo was provided from Scotland to compensate for the free-to-air provision in Scotland for the full BBC service. And that the statement I read wasn't from when Maria Miller was in Scotland, but actually in Oxford, so she's said the same more than once. But the question is, would it be possible to negotiate an arrangement whereby the full panoply of BBC services was available through all transmission mechanisms in Scotland on a continuing basis at the same time as funds were available for establishment of a Scottish broadcasting service, and there was a continued production of programmes here for the BBC network services, which opens up those wide opportunities for producers and production companies in Scotland. The deal that is set out is extremely attractive to Scotland if it can be negotiated and if it can be implemented. But I'm simply saying that it is not a deal that can be deemed done until negotiations and discussion have taken place.
Thank you very much. Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Convener. I'm looking at the evidence that's been provided by Equity, and just to follow up with a similar thread, Equity say that the exposure that can be achieved through the BBC is essential in the English-speaking world market in terms of a performer's exposure globally. BBC Worldwide, BBC America, the iPlayer and a sophisticated sales and commissioning network all combine to give unparalleled exposure to BBC productions. And Equity say in their evidence that it would be almost impossible to recreate this distribution system from scratch. I appreciate that Equity are not here today, but I wonder if anybody else would like to... Oh, right. Scrub that then, I beg your pardon.
Okay. I'm sure we'll come back to it if you want.
Yeah, forgive me.
Okay, Liam MacArthur.
Just following up the line of question from the convener there, I mean, I think everybody at this end of the table would wish to see maximise the opportunity for production companies and content being produced in Scotland, whatever our differences over the question being posed in September. But presumably part of the delicate negotiations that Jeremy Peets have referred to would be consideration being given to licence payers in the remaining part of the UK where Scotland to vote for independence about what their expectations were in relation to how spend is produced. And I suspect there's probably a growing number of people who would expect further kind of progression made in terms of taking production out with that M25 corridor. But that the difficulty for production companies in Scotland would be a demand on politicians and on the BBC to secure as much content as possible from within the remaining part of the UK. Is that not a fair assumption to make?
Can I just make a first comment, which is that I'm very pleased that of two things that happened during my time as Governor and then trustee. First was the agreed increase in the share of network programming that was produced out with Central London, and the fact that we have reached or had reached a per capita share for Scotland of the value of programming. I think that is hugely important, that that is available in addition to the production for opts on the BBC One and BBC Two programmes, and indeed for Radio Scotland and the like. The second point is that I'm very pleased that BBC Alba exists and now exists on Freeview. Again, something that I worked hard to achieve. And I think that BBC Alba is an example of providing an entree for smaller production companies into the television business in what might be termed a fairly niche area of Gaelic production, but one that gives them experience, gives them expertise, and enables them to then develop and spread their wings into providing programming, I hope, and then competing for programming, whether it be from BBC or wherever. So I think that it is important to have the opportunities for the creative sector in Scotland to get involved in programming through the likes of BBC Alba and the Ops, but also the ability to have 9 or 10% share of network programming made in Scotland provides another very important opportunity for the production companies to actually see the opportunities there. Having Waterloo Road in Scotland is another major stable story that helps. So you need this combination. Sorry?
You do know that Waterloo Road has been cancelled?
Over the period it was here, it provided a major...
Sorry, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but isn't this the point that at least some members of this committee are trying to make? That those decisions to gift Scotland Waterloo Road are the same people who can then take it away. So effectively, that lack of control creates the very problem that you're trying to suggest is solved by a gift of Waterloo Road.
But you still have an agreement which is for the Trust to implement that a per capita share of network programming will be produced in Scotland. So if Waterloo Road moves away, then there has to be other network programming to an equivalent value so that that is maintained. Now, that is what I hope is the outcome that can be sustained, and it is there in agreements that the Trust is there to enforce. Now, that is the position as at the moment.
Equivalent committee in a Westminster context would be under presumably additional pressure to maximise the amount of content and production within the remaining part of the UK in any negotiation reached post-independence.
Which is why the White Paper refers to there being an agreement as part of the negotiations whereby an agreed amount of programming is provided to BBC for network purposes from Scotland on a continuing basis. So that would have to be negotiated. And yes, there would be many parties, I'm sure, in the rest of the UK who would wish to see an opportunity for more programming being undertaken within the rest of the UK. But the agreement that is proposed in the White Paper would maintain that value or share of broadcasting of production remaining within Scotland.
Which is presumably why some of PAC's members are at least apprehensive about this, this possibility.
I think that there are opportunities, and there are some of these were well articulated in the ECOS report that was prepared, referred to earlier, prepared for Scottish Enterprise, that suggested that Scotland needs more of a strategic plan in engaging with independent production companies. And I think the beginnings of this were demonstrated, I think, last summer when there was an announcement around BBC and Channel 4 were going to collaborate in actually engaging with the sector, not just with a handful of sort of tried and tested companies, but with, opening out the umbrella and them working to develop the sector and nurture talent. And that's the sort of thing that we'd be looking to happen in the future as well, this sort of plan for Scotland to develop what is a sector in pretty good shape at the moment. It has a lot of future potential too.
Blair Adamson.
Just a supplementary on that one. Thank you, Convener. In terms of Waterloo Road, well, I appreciate the argument about the production value being distributed away from sort of London and the South East and across the country. Is there not a real danger there in that effectively what happens is that the production model arrives in Scotland, there's no intellectual property, if you like, in Scotland of Waterloo Road, and effectively you're just assembling someone else's production there, and there's no added value in terms of developing talent, as Rosina was just saying, and actually nurturing and developing the creativity in Scotland.
I certainly agree that it is a significant loss for Waterloo Road with its continuing base to move away. And what Scotland must avoid is having programming which is deemed to be made in Scotland but involve people coming up on the sleeper or the plane and then going down south again. That is not a way of adding value to the creative sector in Scotland. There has to be a firm basis for the programming that it is genuinely made in Scotland. And I think it is very welcome that more commissioners and their colleagues have moved to Pacific Quay than was the case in the past. But the deal is not yet firm and remaining. But the BBC Trust is responsible for BBC compliance with the arrangements for nations and region television programme and maintaining it. So the arrangement is in place, but it is important that that not be, as I say, the up and down programme provision. It has to be programming that is firmly embedded in Scotland, that has a very high percentage of Scottish talent involved throughout the process, and that adds value within Scotland to the creative sector, not just at the time it takes place, but potentially going forward, so experience is gained. So it's the type of programming that matters just as much as the actual theoretical cost.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, did you not indicate you had a question?
I do have a question. Do you want
Yes, it's
supplementary?
you.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a little bit about, in further detail, about regulation as proposed in the white paper. Obviously, the Scottish Government have said that they want to reduce regulation across the board in Scotland, and what they've suggested is a combined economic regulator that would cover broadcasting. And I would just like, I think it was Rosina who mentioned that there were specific areas to get some more information about what the issues would be for the broadcasting community in that area, and also to maybe understand a bit better the BBC Trust's regulatory responsibilities and how that might be implemented in the model that's presented in the white paper.
Should I kick off, Mr. Chairman? Convener. I think there are probably three elements to regulation that need to be taken into account. The first is the responsibilities that at the moment are with the BBC Trust for impartiality, accuracy and oversight generally of the delivery of public value. Those are, I think, appropriate for an arm's length body of some sort, and they are very different from economic regulation of the type that the Competition and Markets Authority or Ofgem and the like undertake. So I think that it is important that there be an arrangement whereby impartiality and the delivery of quality, the handling of complaints and everything is available, that there is a body that can undertake that is seen to be itself impartial and arm's length. So something has to replace the BBC Trust in the event of a Scottish Broadcasting Service being set up in order to oversee that element. Then there is the role of Ofcom, which clearly has a role with regard to commercial broadcasters, which Mr. Hayne and others are better placed to, but also does have joint responsibilities with the BBC Trust for various elements of oversight of broadcasting per se. And I think that one needs to consider whether that can be undertaken within the joint regulator that's proposed or whether that is a separate entity. Then the third element is where Ofcom effectively acts as a first stage competition policy regulator. So it can then refer matters to what was the Competition Commission and is now the Competition and Markets Authority. So if there was, for example, a dispute over the way in which advertising revenue was distributed between channels and whether that was an effective means of stimulating competition or whether it was impeding the proper workings of competition, at the moment Ofcom can refer that to the CMA, and the CMA can then undertake a full investigation. Now, the joint regulator, as proposed, I understand, in Scotland would undertake that type of investigation, but the question would be whether there should be separation between the initial consideration, which at the moment takes place in Ofcom, and the full investigation, which takes place in the CMA and would take place in the combined regulator. So I think there are various aspects that need to be considered, in addition, of course, to the question of collection of the licence fee, decisions as to what restrictions on payment should be made, how one should follow up non-payment, whether it should be a criminal offence, and the like. So there are a number of issues, but I think one has to look at how the BBC Trust is replaced in some way, how Ofcom with its public sector and other broadcasting responsibilities works, and how one deals with the competition aspects in a fair manner. I'm sure they're all manageable, but I think one needs to think of them in those separate categories.
Sorry, Rosina, I think there's some questions directed at yourself.
I'm not sure I have too much to add to the comments I made earlier about the options for regulating the sector. I think we're just keen, PACT is very keen to be part of discussions and part of the process as some of the detail is worked through and ironed out. So I think beyond the comments I made earlier, I've not got too much to add at the moment.
We have had quite a bit of comparison with Ireland this morning. I'm going to go there again because I've had the description of the relationship between Ofcom and Comreg, which is the Irish regulatory authority, as being like a spectrum of cooperation depending on what's actually required. Does anyone care to comment on how that works and at the moment?
Yep. I think that's a no.
That's fair enough.
Can I, just on the regulation point, because I was going to ask you earlier, but Lee MacArthur asked right at the beginning about your comment at 4.2 of Pact's evidence about the regulator when you say that you have reservations about whether they, that's in Scotland you're talking about, would have appropriate independence from the Scottish Government, the regulator. Again, what, I think Mr MacArthur asked, why would it be any different from the regulator that currently exists? I don't remember you answering the question. Why do you think it might be different?
No, well, I think, as I mentioned before, we were just keen to get across in this particular section, you know, without any of the detail being particularly worked through yet. And I don't think we've had direct conversations with the Scottish Government about regulation so far. Was just merely to make the point that it obviously would be important to maintain independence and also to maintain, you know, some positive working with Ofcom to share expertise and knowledge and skills to, you know, make sure that UK-wide regulation can function in an effective way.
It's just that you said in your evidence that you have reservations around a separate regulator for Scotland, particularly around whether they would have the appropriate independence from the Scottish Government. Mm-hmm. What leads you to suggest that there would be any problem with appropriate independence from the Scottish Government, which would be any different from appropriate independence from the UK Government?
Well, I think through the evidence, what we've tried to do is collate, you know, a range of views and, you know, that have been expressed by members and distill them into one response. And I think it was just merely to reflect that it'll be an important part of you know, a regulator functioning in an independent and
so your point,
well-respected way.
Yes, your point is, if I can summarise it, what you're actually saying is that you know, in independent Scotland, it's important that the regulator, however that's formed, should be independent. Mm-hmm. That's actually what you mean by that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Just finally, if I can ask Mr. Halloran, you mentioned earlier that when you were being asked by Gordon MacDonald about the £5 million referendum unit, you said that was money being returned effectively. Is that in relation to the £16 million cut?
I understand that's where it came from.
Yes. So in reality, instead of BBC Scotland taking a £16 million cut, it's taken an £11 million cut.
Yes.
That's the reality there. Could you put in context for me the £5 million? What would the £5 million is for the entire referendum units in the production of BBC in Scotland intends to use from now or from several months ago up to and including the actual date of the referendum. Now, is that a lot of money to spend on that, or is that a small amount of money to spend? I mean, what's the context of that? What would £5 million buy you in terms of other programming?
Well, I think that was part of the frustration amongst the staff, in that there was very little discussion on what that might entail in respect to staffing levels and also the programmes that were being planned. I think early last month there was a briefing by the head of the Independence Referendum Unit with staff. It was an open invitation to people to hear about the plans for various programmes, and obviously the £5 million would go towards that as well. So it's difficult quantifying that. Part of the problem was, as Smith asked earlier, having the statistics there in respect to who was being hired and what salaries they were and what roles they were playing. That lack of transparency, I suppose, makes that difficult to answer. At the meeting with Tony Hall, the Director General, when one of our union reps raised it with him, he said, we'll make £5 million available and more if required. So one of our questions to BBC Scotland management would be, you know, is the £5 million sufficient for what you're doing? If you have an opportunity to go back for more, have you? And if you haven't, why not? So it's that type of dialogue, and I think it's unfortunate BBC are not here to maybe sort of enlighten us on that.
Can I just clarify, have you asked BBC management, following that comment from Mr Hall, have you asked them whether or not they have gone back to BBC in London and said we want to spend a different figure, 6 million?
That was part of our discussion. That's a big open meeting when Tony Hall was up.
Yeah, but do you know whether BBC Scotland management have done that work?
No.
No, you don't know, or no, they haven't?
No, we don't know.
You don't know? Oh, okay, thank you. Just one final question to Mr Hayne. Just, if Scotland votes for independence, what would you envisage be the relationship between STV and the ITV network post-independence?
Well, we have just signed an agreement which is required by the current Ofcom framework and the regulatory framework for Channel 3 licences, whereby the cost of the network productions that everyone shares are met by all the different licences chipping in. Effectively, it's a structure that's worked since 1957 when we came on air. So, in order to proceed on that basis for the next licence period, which we've just entered into, we've struck a deal with ITV, new commercial arrangements where we will continue to receive ITV network programming that they will make. We will continue to contribute our own programming into the service, and in order to know that that deal can persist and through the licence period, and we're able to accept the licences that have been offered, we were able to rely on the Scottish Government announcement that they will respect the terms of those licences until 2024, which is the next term for our licence, and indeed for Channel 4 and 5, and for the new local TV licences. So our relationship with ITV will remain the same as it is currently.
Right, so in terms of post-independence, STV, and you said Channel 4 and Channel 5, effectively, those licences go to 2024, 25?
Yes, 24.
The mid-20s, and there would be no change, therefore, in terms of post-independence?
Not through that licence period.
Not through that licence period. Okay, that's very helpful. Can I thank you all very much for coming along this morning and answering your questions. It's been very interesting and very helpful. We do appreciate you taking the time to appear before us, and I will suspend briefly again to allow a change over witnesses. Good morning again. Our second panel of witnesses is here to discuss the topic of culture. So that's a rather broad topic, of course. But can I welcome Lorne Boswell, who's the Scottish Secretary of Equity, and of course Richard Holloway, who's the Chair of Systema Scotland. A very interesting programme on last night, was it?
Was, yep. Can I say I'm not entirely sure why I'm here, but it's always nice to come to Hollywood.
I think you're here, Mr. Holloway, because of your the breadth of your experience and knowledge in the area.
Oh God, that's a bad start.
Can I thank you both for your written submissions to the committee? Again, very interesting and helpful. We're going to go straight to questions, and I'm going to start with Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Convener. I'm going to now ask the question I asked inappropriately at the last panel. So my question is for you, Mr. Boswell, from Equity, or for either of you, but if you could expand a little bit on the comments in your evidence about the networks and the distribution and the exposure that comes to performers through the BBC's global presence. And you've said in your evidence it would be almost impossible to recreate this distribution system from scratch. So I would imagine that the lack of that network would be to performers' detriment.
When we formulated our policy on what's going to happen in September, we tried to look at it from an actor's point of view, an actor living in Scotland. What do they want? What are their expectations? And we looked across the breadth of everything that's happening, and broadcasting was the obvious area that was likely to see change. In many ways, it's a regret that Calman didn't address it, because he could have maybe done something there, but it hasn't been addressed. So broadcasting will have to be addressed, no matter what the result in September. And so from an actor's point of view, you still want to be able to work and get the most exposure that you possibly can. There's much been made of the Danish productions, Borgen and so on. Had BBC Three not picked them up, those actors would still be unknown. They'd still be total unknowns. And from an actor's point of view, you need as much exposure as you can possibly get. So when we came to look at our submission, and I would beg you to look at it in the round and not just pick off little bits, because I'm fully aware that various sides of the arguments might say that, well, that suits us and that doesn't. Although, interestingly, when it was put to our national executive in London, who endorsed it entirely, there was one dissenting voice who suggested that it was written by Alex Salmond himself, which I think was a bit bizarre. We are advocating that the BBC is part of the social union of these islands, and that we should keep the BBC post-independence. We're also advocating that there should be a national broadcaster for Scotland, but I think it's incumbent upon the government of the day to say what that is, because it could be anything, to define what it is. And I just warned Bobby Hayne that I was going to say this. We see no reason why STV couldn't be the national broadcaster for the sake of argument. Well, there's a slight issue in the south of Scotland, but I'm sure that could be addressed. We'd ask you to look at it in the round. And the BBC is a fantastic organisation, and I bow to no one in my admiration for it, but it's far from perfect. And there's a growing movement across the whole of the United Kingdom, as it currently exists, against the BBC being so horribly London-centric. I have colleagues in the Midlands who are a fantastic website, Campaign for Regional Broadcasting Midlands, if you have a chance to look at it. The amount of licence fee that's raised in the Midlands, that's spent in the Midlands, is absolutely negligible. If you think the situation in Scotland is bad, look at the Midlands, it's terrible. So there's a growing movement across these islands to get the BBC out of London. And we're calling for a proportionate BBC. Jeremy Peet said that they're moving towards that, but I think their definition of what constitutes a Scottish programme really needs to be looked at quite closely. And we're calling for a BBC that's protected from Westminster, because if you look at the BBC for the last 35 years, since the ascent of the Blessed Margaret, the various governments of all political hues have kicked the BBC quite viciously. And I'd suggest to you that the attempt to decriminalise the licence fee is simply another attempt to weaken the BBC in the run-up to the next charter renewal.
Thank you. And I do accept that your evidence is much broader than the point that I raised, and that you've alluded to some of your other topics in your comments. So If it's impossible to recreate this distribution system from scratch, are there ways of trying to imitate it or circumvent it? Are there alternatives?
Inevitably, there would be. I mean, we were very pleased to see that the white paper suggested almost a federal arrangement with the BBC. We were slightly concerned that the white paper was going to go down the RTE route, and the reason that we didn't favour that was simply, if you talk to Irish actors, the vast majority of them, will move to London once their careers start, because London is where the decisions are made, and that needs to be unpicked. And I would urge members of all parties to take an interest in that and making sure that we wrench control of what's effectively public spending, because the licence fee is effectively public spending. We wrench control of that and offer a fair opportunity for well, it's too late for people like me, but for our kids.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Just to follow that up, I think that's a very interesting point that you made. Because, you said in your, as you say, written submission, it would be almost impossible to recreate this distribution system from scratch, which Jane Baxter fairly commented on. But I think my understanding of what's being proposed is that we're not going to try and recreate it from scratch. We're actually going to try and expand on what happens here in Scotland, use the money more effectively that is raised here in Scotland, but also be a part of that larger group in a, if you like, a federal or a confederal sort of setup. Do you want to comment on that and how you think it would operate?
I think that could work, but inevitably there are lots of ifs and buts in that, and there's a massive negotiation to be had. And from the BBC's record in appearing here, it isn't glorious. So I'm not sure how this negotiation is going to come out, but I certainly think the objective of being able to plug into that network is one that I think is very desirable.
To be fair to the BBC, and it's not in my nature, but to be fair to them, they did say that they wouldn't comment on any of the outcomes around negotiations prior to the decision being taken by the Scottish people in September. So I'm sure afterwards they'd be more than happy to enter into those discussions. Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Could I ask you, gentlemen, about Scottishness? In the context of the referendum, irrespective of our views, I think the debate is asking us to look at what we identify as our Scottishness, and particularly in the culture debate, how we make the best possible use of the resources which we have, and they are very significant. But we've sat through many committee meetings here where there have been discussions about the correct strategic direction of the arts and culture in Scotland. I have to say tribute to the Cabinet Secretary, who I think has taken the right principled approach and philosophical approach to the arts in Scotland. But we've seen in debates about Scottish film, about some issues in Scottish opera, about Creative Scotland, and we're now debating a bill that will bring together Historic Scotland and ARCAMS. What do you think we have to do that will improve the strategic direction of culture and the arts in Scotland?
I think you probably have to return to the old philosophical debate about the difference between the intrinsic value of the arts and the instrumental value of the arts. And I think that what happened with the stooshy around Creative Scotland, I think it got its discourse mixed here, because I think they wrongly thought it would be more attractive to politicians if they punted the instrumental view of the arts. It's good for GDP, it's all of that. I think these are secondary effects of the main good of the arts, which is the health of the human community, art for art's sake. It's undoubtedly true that if you make a good film, if you write a good book, if you get a great play, money comes in, but you don't do it for that reason. And I think that we probably need in Scotland to get our heads clear about this. Culture is intrinsic to our humanity. It's what we've done with our spare time. And it's the thing that distinguishes us from the other creatures that we share the planet with. And I think it's a mistake to let the market start dominating. I think the market dominates too many of our values in the world. And I would hope that Scotland would develop a kind of flourishing attitude to the arts for their own sake, because Scotland is an intrinsically creative place. It wasn't always in the same. It's always been good with words, but after the Reformation it got slightly less enthusiastic about some of the other things. And what I would like would be a kind of just a great efflorescence of artistic creativity in Scotland for its own sake, recognising that it has to be managed. You have to have good producers, good actors, good writers, and everyone goes up. But if we got that particular recognition settled, everything else would follow. I think it got lost in the Creative Scotland debate.
Some of our artists, some of our most important artists, most successful ones, and I have to say most outstanding ones, are making the point that they believe the natural resources for this flourishing that you're talking about is there, but it needs to come together. And it needs that leadership. In fact, I think you referred to that in your own evidence. It needs a leadership and a strategic direction about how we maximise the benefit of that artistic colour in Scotland. I take your point about the intrinsic values and the education, etc. That's crucially important. But does it not need something else? I think you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, your evidence about leadership. Where do we get that from?
No, I think you actually get it from artists, you get it from social reformers. I think you can get it from politicians, and I think that Fiona Hislop has been offering a very interesting philosophical position in her recent speeches. I think she gets it. I think it's interesting that her rhetoric is very different to the English Culture Secretary's rhetoric, which is still intrinsically related to the instrumental view. If it's good for the economy, we push it. And I think that what could happen up here is that we could recognise all around that the total health of the nation is tied up with this. I mean, my own experience of children's orchestras in Raploch and Govan Hill is that everything gets better. The children become more determined, more studious, happier, healthier. And if the New Scotland could somehow recognise that, and traditionally it's been rather economically grudging towards the arts. It's the first thing that tends to suffer in schools, whereas I think in the more deprived schools it should be the thing that's actually emphasised. I don't think this is very difficult to do. I think it would have severe funding implications. In my own work, I say to Scottish ministers, this isn't just about culture, this is about health, it's about housing, it's about well-being, it's about criminality. It costs us about $1,500 a year to keep a kid in a Systema orchestra. You can spend $200,000 a year keeping a kid in secure accommodation. I mean, the logic is there. You only have to save 5 kids and you've got a whole Systema.
But there are artists at present, and I heard some of them on television last night, who are adamant that more needs to be done to allow them to flourish to their full ability. What I think I'm driving at is, do we need an independent Scotland to do that, in your view, or is that something that could be addressed through a UK basis, in fact, through an international basis?
I think artists are always a bit, they're never happy. When I was chair of the Scottish Arts Council, I got used to their whinging. It almost comes with the psychology. So I don't think you should liberate them to do their work, but don't, I think, necessarily allow them to dictate politics, because you'll be all over the place, frankly. And I think that the best thing artists can do is make art. Some of them are also very interested in politics, but they're no better guides or judges of politics than plumbers or fishmongers.
I beg pardon to disagree with the previous speaker. Liz, can I give you a two-part answer to that? We passed a motion at the STUC last week urging the Creative Scotland to look to invest in people, to look to invest in our kids, and I think that's how you address Scottishness. You develop the individuals and you force the focus down onto them. What we've, Creative Scotland is the successor to the Scottish Arts Council, which grew out of the Arts Council of Great Britain, and it used to be about institutions. It was about creating an opera company and about bringing a ballet company up from Bristol, and we argued the infrastructure is now there. Let's not worry about the infrastructure. Let's now drill down and put the accent and the emphasis and the funding onto the people, so that future generations will be able to emulate those standout artists that we have, in all fields, across the world. And the other part of my answer to your question is specific about television. We've been having meetings with Ofcom. Ofcom have definitions for programmes. They define programmes as coming from different parts of the United Kingdom, and it's Alice in Wonderland time. It's absolutely crazy. I don't know whether you saw, I'll give you just one example, whether you saw a beautiful programme about a year in the Hebrides. Monty Don and Monty Hall, one's a gardener, one's an adventurer, I can't remember which, but the adventurer spent a year living in the Hebrides. And you'd have thought that there was a clue in the title and the landscape and what the programme was all about was that fantastic landscape. That programme was actually allocated to the southeast of England because an executive producer's buttock hovered over a chair for 15 minutes, on a wet Thursday. So it's absolutely crazy. And we've challenged Ofcom to include front-of-camera talent, to allow that to determine if the programme is about Scotland. Can it be nominated as a Scottish programme? At the moment, it's simply the behind-camera talent, it's where the producer's based, and it's where a lot of the production spend is. And, of course, a lot of production spend on a television programme is post-production. So Ofcom had promised us a reply before the autumn. They're sitting on this one. I wonder whether they're going to wait till after September before they give us our reply.
Okay. May I just finish on the point of finances? I mean, there are many people across Scotland, including in local authorities and schools, I think even ourselves as parliamentarians, where by definition culture has never received a huge amount of money when it comes to government spending. Do you believe that we need to have more spent to do what you're telling us we need to do, or is it a matter of addressing priorities Mr. Holloway suggested in terms of education, that it's about how you spend that money, or is it about spending more money?
I'm not going to say spend less. Of course, you should maintain. We would argue to maintain and increase the spending. Yeah, we would never say spend less. Focusing spending is kind of the language of cuts, and I would hope that this Parliament would recognise the importance for our kids in the confidence they get from using the expressive arts as an educational tool.
Like of Scottish film and Scottish opera saying that until we spend a bit more money, we're not going to have that international or maintain that international prestige in the same way, and that's obviously a concern.
Yeah, I mean, if you consider the amount of money that goes into the Danish film industry compared to what goes into the Scottish film industry, the point is made. I think spend more, but also spend it more imaginatively, and recognise that you're spending it anyway. If you're in my own area, we are spending a lot of money keeping Scotland unequal. It's very, very expensive to maintain the kind of poverty-stricken districts in the welfare state. Out of the best possible motives, we want to help those areas, and we simply fund the misery in a way. But if you spent some of that money on early intervention programmes, you would get them out of the misery. And I think so we do need more imaginative, risky ways of actually using them. I was very impressed by the way Fiona Hislop persuaded 5 or 6 portfolios in the Scottish Government to put money into Big Noise in Raploch and in Govan Hill. The argument always was that the culture budget is the smallest, and therefore it can't help a thing like Systema Scotland. But if you recognise that it cuts right across everything, then you can expand the culture budget because you recognise that it also increases health. It decreases criminality. So you don't just have it under Fiona Hislop's portfolio. You recognise that she's the point person for making Scotland a bigger and a better place. And so it's more strategic use of money to that end that I think we need.
Okay, thank you.
But you need someone to lead it.
Indeed.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, I'm looking at the written evidence from Equity. I was a little curious as to the phraseology. Paragraph 10, it says, after much debate, and that's the bit I'm curious about, Equity believes the BBC should continue to operate in Scotland after the referendum. Was there a huge debate over this as to yes or no?
Fairly significant debate, yeah. there are lots of equity members who advocate, chopping off at Hadrian's Wall and don't understand why there can't be a budget to fund everything that they want to be funded. And there were other views, but the consensus that was eventually arrived at was that they need the for an actor to have a meaningful career and to be based here, to stay in Scotland, because we define a Scottish member as somebody who has an address here. That they need the exposure that they can get through the BBC networks.
Was there a large majority in the end supporting the BBC continuing to operate?
Yes, I mean I think so, but I think it's some folk are still quizzical about it. Some folk say that they don't understand if Scotland became independent how the BBC could continue, but. I think when you look at it in terms of exposure, that's the bit that was overwhelmingly supported.
Just to move on, I'm always a wee bit cautious putting economic value against culture and the arts, but other areas that Scotland clearly has a lead in, where they clearly outperform?
Do you mean television, or do you mean
in general?
I think it's in people. I mean, if you I said this just after Chris Hoy won his sort of umpteenth gold medal at a public meeting in this building. I said if you tried to identify the most famous Scots on the planet, a significant cohort of those would be actors, and I couldn't tell you why that is, but it's undoubtedly the case. So I think our people are our biggest asset.
We also produce a disproportionate number of great authors and poets. I mean, in Fife alone, you've got about 6 world-class poets. Poets don't make much money, but they do. They make the nation greater. They make it more beautiful, more compassionate. Think of the work of John Burnside, Don Patterson. I mean, we are now that enriches the whole culture, but not in directly economic ways. I mean, look at the impact of the Edinburgh International Book Festival. The fact that book festivals have sprung up all over Scotland. I don't know how many there are now. Certainly around about 40. Wigtown, that little depressed town in Galloway, was restored through the book festival. And then the stupidity came along and wanted to half close the library. I mean, people just don't get these things. So I think that we also produce not many, but some very interesting musicians. We've got some wonderful orchestras. I don't think you can control this. You certainly can't corral, you couldn't corral authors into any kind of agreed policy in all of this, that they disagree about the referendum in September. And that's part of the glory of writers, that they're always at each other's throats. I think Scotland's amazing at the moment, and it's always been good at the word, of course. I mean, the Reformation gave us a kind of a genius for argument, the authority of the Bible in every school, all of that, but we've expanded that into other forms as well. And I think that we do produce a disproportionate number of wonderful actors.
Do you find that there's a significant number of young up-and-coming people to continue that tradition?
Yes, you look at them and you wonder whether they're going to get the lucky breaks, because at the end of the day, that's how you leap into the stratosphere. You get 1 or 2 lucky breaks, and you're in a different ballpark. And there's a significant majority of those people who would love to be able to stay and work in Scotland, but until we kind of re-engineer, particularly the television industry, that's often very hard for them to do.
Okay, thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Just following up Colin Beattie's question, I know you warned us not to pick different parts out of the written evidence, but the temptation is too great when you present it to us. You suggest later on towards the end of the evidence that the BBC should become more answerable to the people of Scotland, by implication Wales and Northern Ireland. It's difficult to see how that happens in a post-independence world, and also the reference earlier you made to the point about the demands of the production sector in the Midlands, for example, when they look at not just what's happening in the south, in London and the south east, but actually what Scotland's been able to achieve, albeit not as much as it would like. Is there not a risk that in a post-independence environment, their claims on getting a larger slice of that that production budget become more difficult for politicians south of the border to answer?
I don't think so, because I think the claim is against London. I think particularly if you look at the BBC, its spend in London is totally disproportionate to any measure of population or any sense of equity. So, and bear in mind that we are a UK union, and we've taken that policy through our UK annual conference. And we've been able to argue it and get support for it. So I think that there is a growing support across the United Kingdom for more proportionate spend by the BBC in the different parts of the United Kingdom.
I think that holds because we're part of the United Kingdom. I think when you then end up having a situation where Scotland is, in effect, an independent country, it's more difficult, I would suggest, for your members to say this should be coming out of...
We're advocating something that I'm not sure anybody else is advocating. We're advocating that post-September, that what's left, both sides of the border, still supports the BBC. And the only sensible way of doing that is on a per capita basis, on a proportionate basis, so that folk look for a fair spend in whatever part of these islands that they live in.
Can I take you on to the area that Liz Smith was exploring, this idea of Scottishness, which I suppose is the subject of much debate and discussion in the run-up to the referendum. Do you think there is a risk that, in a sense, we try to create a Scottishness out of something which in reality is a multiplicity of different cultures and expressions of identity? I mean, I speak as somebody, obviously, who represents Orkney, which has a very different view of itself and its relationship with the rest of Scotland than perhaps those in Edinburgh might have, or those in Aberdeen, or perhaps even the Western Isles. And that, in a cultural sense, that there is a risk that we try to create a Scottishness, I would say, much along the same lines as people are probably rather foolish in trying to define Britishness in a single kind of identifiable way.
I kind of sympathise with that point. I mean, Scotland's always been plural. I mean, you've got the Mearns of Grassic Gibbon. You've got Irvine Welsh's Leith. I mean, they couldn't be more different. Sandy McCall-Smith and Irvine Welsh live in the same city and see very different aspects of it. So I think it is intrinsically plural. What is... I think reaching for some kind of definition of Scottishness, I think, is a bit risky, especially if it hardens. And I prefer... There's a Gaelic culture, which is very rich, which I don't have access to, because I'm a monophone. I don't use it, but I'm aware of its beauty, and I can read it in translation. I wonder what it is about Scotland, whether there are certain elements of distinctiveness, and I think that there are. I think there is a kind of... I think Scotland's always been a little more challenging to power structures and systems, including fashionable intellectual ones. I think that to some extent it's got, and it may be that it came from the Presbyterian polity, which was itself more democratic than what preceded it. But it's a kind of an ethos rather than anything that you can too empirically define. I wouldn't want Scotland to define itself too narrowly, because if more people come flooding in, it will become ethnically more plural. It's already getting that way. So I'm a wee bit suspicious of that. I think it should be generous and understand that humanity anyway is incorrigibly plural, and also great art unifies. I'm reading a great Russian novel at the moment, and it's Russian, but it's also human. All art, all particular art, becomes universal once it's expressed. So let's not be too narrow.
I certainly echo that sentiment. I mean, my sister's children learn Gaelic in a Gaelic primary school in Glasgow, but I know that in my own constituency there's a considerable resistance to any suggestion that there's any Gaelic heritage there, that their Norse heritage is far more important to them. And I think that there's perhaps a challenge in the way that culture and politics interrelate, and that if we're not careful, you take the kind of political imperatives and apply them to culture, and you come up with something that is a bit of a potent mix and not necessarily in the best interests of art and culture more generally. Would that be a fair observation?
Yeah, well, I mean, politicians use almost anything for their own ends, don't they? So I mean, you can do that both ways. I mean, I've no idea. Sorry. Can I make another plea? There's a danger that we professionalise the arts in this way, and that when we think of writers, we're thinking only of published writers. When we're thinking of actors, only those that make it big, musicians. And in fact, if we truly educated the country, we would all become artists, get in touch with their own creativity. I'm as interested in that as I am in the people who actually make it publicly. And we've got a very good amateur arts sets of organisations in Scotland. Lots of things are happening all over the place. And there's no reason why a little bit of funding couldn't trickle into that. That's the glory. I mean, we are expecting to make professional musicians through our work in Systema Scotland, but more importantly, we're going to make big, rounded human beings. Some of them will go on playing the instrument professionally, some of them will go on playing it in an amateur way, others will just go on and become good plumbers and solicitors and politicians.
Okay, thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you. If I could pick up on the theme that's mentioned about a couple of times about nurturing new talent, and I just wondered if Creative Scotland's Youth Arts Strategy Time to Shine is setting us on the right road for that.
Yeah, I think it is. I absolutely think it is, and I think it's putting the spotlight in the area that we need to shine it on. I mean, again, just to put it in context, the Edinburgh International Festival is absolutely brilliant, but what it was about was bringing the best of the world to here. And I think we want to move into a world where we're showing the rest of the world the best of what we have here. And I think anything that shines a spotlight on the talent that we have here and recognises that talent here, rather than forcing it to go somewhere else to be recognised, can only be good for everybody.
Did you want to comment?
No more than that, I don't think.
Thank you.
I think that maybe one thing about the Edinburgh International Festival, remember it came out of World War II, and it was created in a sense by refugees from fascism who knew that art glorified and united in a way that a lot of the other stuff doesn't. And that, I think, is something that we should try not to lose, because we're an increasingly divided world, and it's interesting that arts can reach right across that, and you'll get a bunch of musicians from all sorts of different places, and they forget their conflict in the making of music.
My second question is about the idea of the exposure that you were talking about, and obviously we've had recently very successful tours of National Theatre Scotland and America, and the Celtic Connections was out in America this year as well, and that gives sort of physical opportunities for people to appear. But I'm quite intrigued by whether, when we're talking about the BBC model and the Federation and all the rest of it, and all these wonderful bits of art that we watch from other countries as well, if we're really up to speed with what impact the internet is having on consumption of content, and particularly some of the subscription areas where you can go on the internet and see content from the BBC from all across the world, and what impact that's actually having on how this whole issue of distribution is in the world.
I think it is having an impact. A friend of mine who for her sins has to take a job in the Cayman Islands was just sending me a message telling me how much she enjoyed Shetland, but she didn't miss the weather. Yeah. I mean, it is a way of internationalising things. The problem with the internet, there's not much serious content that's put free onto the internet, because the minute you put it there, you can't control it. And anybody who makes a program wants to control it so they can get the revenue from it. So the iPlayer, for example, is normally limited to 30 days after transmission. That's the deal for something in which there are dramatic rights. Other programs on the iPlayer, where there aren't dramatic rights, are on there for a longer time. So it'll always be a question of control. Whoever pays to employ my members will want to exploit that work in whatever way they can. But I mean, I do think that you mentioned the National Theatre of Scotland. Scottish Ballet is doing an enormous amount of international touring at the moment, and I think they're fantastic ambassadors for Scotland. And there's an interest. Everybody attributes it to the play Black Watch, which was a great event. But I think that was a culmination of a lot of other things that were happening, and there's a self-confidence, there's a burgeoning of talent. When we were talking about Scottish artists, actors would want to thank the kind of golden generation of playwrights we've got at the moment, because most actors hate not having somebody else's words to speak. But there is a self-confidence, and there's a projection of Scotland, which I think is only positive.
Can I come at it from another angle? One of the things, I mean, I'm not a kind of a digital native. I'm too old to get it. But one of the things I like about it is, again, the way it's deprofessionalizing a lot of stuff. Humans have a way to expropriate things that belong to everyone. So book critics become professional, film critics. They tell you what to think of a movie. And what the web has done, it's to kind of horizontalize all of that. And you get, if you want to buy a book, you can tap and get 50 reviews of it on Amazon.com without necessarily believing what you read in the Sunday papers. I quite like that, because I'm interested in flattening hierarchies, and I think that in many ways there's something very democratic. It's also democratically dangerous, because there are lots of bad people out there who use it as well. But I personally celebrate it because I like the way that it's enabling people who might not otherwise be discovered have their moment and have their say. It's the amateur principle again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Gordon MacDonald.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a couple of quick questions about the opportunities available to equity members. What you said earlier was that a lot of actors would like to stay and work in Scotland, and they're all looking for that lucky break. Now, if you look at the BBC Scotland's local television hour output for 2012-13, when you exclude news, current affairs and sport, there is only 143 hours broadcast from Scotland that could have your members involved. And I'm just wondering what your views would be on the establishment of a Scottish broadcasting service, whether it was part of the BBC family or not. Would it give your members more opportunities?
Well, I hope it would, but I hope that any serious consideration of a national broadcaster would not just be limited to news and current affairs.
Yeah.
So I hope it would look at Scotland in the wider sense, and the programmes that most people want to see are the ones that our members are in. And for that simplistic self-interested reason, we'd support a national broadcaster. Full stop. But I think folk would be genuinely interested in having a national broadcaster. But I think it depends what the remit is, and I think that's up to the government to actually work out. Because I don't think we'd be as interested in a version of the Romanian state broadcaster. Yeah. But I think something that reflected cultural life in Scotland, that showed Scotland as it is, would be something that would be of massive interest.
And what's the major issue? I mean, if a Scottish broadcasting service wasn't established, I mean, you've called for one of the BBC channels to be based in Scotland. What's the major issue with that happening? What's stopping that?
The major issue is that the hierarchy of the BBC don't believe they need to move out of London. They all eat in the same restaurants. They all look at the same views. They all see the world from the same point of view. And the pinnacle is to be in London. back when Taggart first started, and I'm old enough to remember when it first started, the first thing they put in the budget were 2 trips to London for the producer, allegedly. And it took a long time for that to come out of the budget because the television industry was so London-centric. If the BBC is to really be British, whatever that means, then it should reflect everything that happens here. I think it would better be called the London Broadcasting Corporation at the moment because it is so centred on London.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Can I just finish up by asking you to speculate slightly here? I mean, clearly there are views on both sides of this debate about what will happen if it's a yes and what will happen if a no. It seems to me, and maybe I'm biased, but it seems to me that the larger side of the artistic community is on the yes side of the debate. It certainly feels that way to me. I just wonder whether or not what you think the reasons for that is. Do you think that many artists see opportunity in independence? In other words, many artistic flourishings come from change in society. And I just wonder whether artists, in the broadest sense, see great opportunity in that possibility of change.
Can I hazard a reply to this? Because I puzzle about it too. It seems to me that, apart altogether from your specific question, it seems to me that on the whole, artists tend to be strange kind of creatures who have more of a feel for the future than other people. When there's an evolution or a revolution in an art form, for instance, it's usually some kind of unexpected new way of doing something. And I think that probably, therefore, artists are almost more intrinsically disposed towards new futures than the rest of the population. Most people are a bit cautious about change. They're innately and appropriately conservative. But if that's all you get, then you never get any, you just get endless repetition in human history. The people that make evolution possible are usually the people on the edge, the kind of slightly odd people out, who somehow are in touch with what's coming because they're less fiddled to what is. And so I think that's maybe one reason why they tend to anticipate trends. And I don't think you can give necessarily moral value to that because they might anticipate trends that aren't going to be very, very healthy. But I don't think it's surprising they were in the forefront of the argument for devolution. I think they always tend to be more in the nature of change agents. You need change agents just as you need accelerators in a car, but you also need brakes. And I think artists tend to be more on the accelerating side, with lots of people with a big, heavy foot on the brake. That's my own hunch.
That's an interesting analogy. I'm not sure I want to go there, but I don't know if Mr. Boswell has any comment.
Equity doesn't have a vote, so equity is not going to say one way or the other. Our members have very strong feelings, and a lot of those points of views are out there in the public domain. But I think our job is to protect their interests, because no matter what happens in September, there will still be bad employers out there. They will still need a trade union, and we aim to focus on representing them on the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th of September.
It seems to me that one of the things that we maybe haven't spent enough time thinking about is what happens after the vote, no matter what it is. Because there are going to be a lot of very hurt and disappointed people, and we're going to have to find strategies to gather round whatever the decision is. And I suspect artists and creative people will be part of that as well, because they're used to disjunctions, to disconnects and all of that. But I think we need to start paying attention to that. And I'm, particularly if it's a narrow yes vote, I think if it's a narrow yes vote, almost half the country will feel to some extent nakedly rejected. And I think we're going to have to spend a lot of emotional, psychological and artistic time working through that, because it's not going to be a good future for Scotland if half the country has to be dragged into it. Whether we take longer to achieve that, I don't know. But it's something that I think your committee should be giving its mind to, no matter what, because we're going to be one country, no matter which way the vote goes. And I hope there'll be no gloating on either side. I like what Churchill said, in defeat, defiance, in victory, magnanimity. There's going to be scope for both of those things.
I think on that point we'll leave it. I think that's a good place to, because otherwise the politician will come out, and I suspect it's probably a bad thing to do. Can I thank you very much for your evidence today? It's been very helpful, and we do appreciate you giving the time to come to the committee today. So thank you very much for that. Our final evidence session on the inquiry will take place next week, when we will hear from the relevant Cabinet Secretaries. And that concludes today's business, and I therefore close the meeting. Thank you. Can I ask the committee...